Imagine for a moment that the war in the Pacific had ended differently. Imagine that on a moonlit night in the summer of 1945, an American sailor standing watch on a destroyer somewhere near the Marshall Islands noticed something that should never have been there, a metallic gleam moving just beneath the surface of the swells, something so impossibly vast that its wake alone would have betrayed its presence to any trained observer. And then imagine that thing surfacing, breaking the black water with a groan of compressed metal, revealing not just a submarine, but something far stranger, a moving island, a steel fortress carrying within it something no other navy in the world possessed at that moment, an entire squadron of aircraft, folded and hidden in a hangar built into the very spine of the boat itself. What would have happened if that mission had succeeded? What might the course of human history have been if Japan's grandest secret weapon had found its target? This is the story of that weapon. This is the story of the I-400 and her sister boats, the largest submarines ever built, underwater aircraft carriers that represented the most audacious and elaborate submarine design of the entire Second World War. And it is a story that was almost lost to history entirely, hidden beneath layers of secrecy, forgotten in the rush of peace, and finally brought to light only through the persistence of researchers and the fragmentary memories of the men who built them and sailed them across the darkest years of the Pacific War. If you've ever wondered about the secret weapons programs of the Second World War, the engineering marvels that were born in secrecy and died in shadow, then I'd like to invite you to subscribe to this channel and join us as we unfold the complete history of the Japanese I-400 submarines, underwater aircraft carriers. We explore these hidden stories together, the forgotten innovations, the lives of the men who served in them, and the quiet resting places where they finally came to rest. Subscribe now, and as each new chapter of this voyage becomes available, you'll receive it as a gift while you sleep. Now, picture yourself on the deck of a transport vessel, somewhere in the pre-dawn darkness of the Pacific in the year 1942. The war has been at sea for months already. America has felt the sting of Pearl Harbor. Midway has changed the calculus of naval power. And yet, in the offices of the Imperial Japanese Navy, in the high rooms where admirals still believed that the war might yet be won, there exists a question that burns like a coal in the darkness. It is a question asked by a man named Isoroku Yamamoto, one of Japan's greatest naval strategists, a man who had studied in America, who understood the reach of American industry in ways that many of his colleagues could not. The question is this: what if we could carry the war itself across the ocean, not as a fleet that could be seen and fought and sunk, but as a ghost, invisible until the moment of strike? What if we could build a submarine so large, so capable, that it could transport its own air force across thousands of miles of open water, undetected, and deliver bombing runs on American soil itself? It is an impossible dream, perhaps, but in 1942, with the momentum still on Japan's side, with brilliant engineers standing ready and shipyards at full capacity, impossible dreams sometimes become steel and rivets and the ambitions of nations. The vision takes shape first in the minds of men sitting in offices in Tokyo, in the naval headquarters where charts and models are moved across tables in the dim light of wartime economy. It is not a new idea, this notion of submarines carrying aircraft. Other nations have toyed with it. The British have experimented. The Americans have tinkered. But what Japan proposes is something far more ambitious than the modest seaplanes that other nations have imagined. Japan proposes to build a submarine that will carry not one aircraft, not two, but a full squadron. Japan proposes to seal them inside a hangar, watertight and pressurized, a structure built directly into the hull of the boat itself. Japan proposes to design an entirely new aircraft, one that can fold itself, origami-like, into impossible shapes, so that these machines can be stored in a space that seems far too small for them. And Japan proposes to do all of this while maintaining the submarine's ability to dive, to remain submerged for weeks, to travel thousands of nautical miles without surfacing for fuel or supplies. It is an engineering problem unlike any before it. It is a problem that will consume years of study, countless calculations, dozens of false starts and designs that are abandoned in the dark of the design studios. And yet, the vision persists, because the vision matters. Because if it can be done, if it can truly be done, then Japan has created something that will change the nature of war itself. The hangar itself becomes the central obsession. How do you build a structure, watertight and strong, that sits atop a submarine hull and does not compromise the boat's ability to submerge? Every pound of extra weight must be accounted for. Every rivet must be placed with surgical precision. The hangar must be large enough to accommodate the folded aircraft, but it must also be aerodynamic enough that when the submarine moves through the water, it does not create unnecessary drag, does not reveal itself through the disturbance it leaves in the water. And when it comes time for the aircraft to be launched, when the hangar doors must open and the planes must be assembled and made ready for flight, all of this must happen on the surface, in what may be minutes, in what may be precious few minutes before enemy aircraft or vessels discover what is happening. Picture the interior of such a hangar, if you can imagine it. Picture the precision required. The aircraft inside must not shift. They must be secured in a way that prevents them from moving even slightly when the submarine performs sharp maneuvers or when the ocean sends swells across her deck. And yet they must be removable, must be able to be lifted and positioned in such a way that they can be assembled into their full configuration, their wings extended, their floats attached, their engines checked and readied, all within moments of the hangar doors opening to the moonlit sky. The men who design this do not sleep well. The men who oversee this do not forget what they are building, because this is not merely an engineering marvel. This is a weapon designed to bring the war home to America. This is a weapon designed to strike at the mainland, to demonstrate to the American people that they are not safe, that the ocean does not protect them, that Japan's reach is longer than anyone has imagined. And as the designs take shape, as the papers accumulate, and the calculations become more refined, there emerges from this fever of innovation a ship class that will bear the name Sen Toku. Sen meaning submarine, Toku meaning special. These are submarines of the special type, submarines that are not quite submarines as anyone has ever understood the term, and not quite aircraft carriers, and not quite transports, but some impossible hybrid of all three things. The first of these boats will be designated I-400. I, because this is a submarine, is the letter the Imperial Japanese Navy uses for its submarine designations, and 400 because she is being built as part of a new wave of construction, a new class that breaks entirely with everything that has come before. When she is completed, when she is finally launched into the water and her engines roar to life, she will be the largest submarine ever built by any nation. She will be longer than a destroyer. She will be wider, in some places, than a battleship is tall. And she will carry within her hull not weapons alone, but a vision of how war itself might be waged in the new age that is dawning. But all of this is still in the future. In 1942, when the decision is made, when the blueprints are approved, and the keels are laid, she is still only a vision. She is steel that has not yet been forged. She is a hope that has not yet been born. And she is being born in a nation that is beginning, in ways both subtle and obvious, to understand that the war it has started may take far longer to win than anyone initially believed. The question of where these boats will be built is settled quickly. The Kure Naval Shipyard, already one of Japan's greatest centers of shipbuilding, a place where some of the most famous warships in the history of naval warfare have taken shape, is designated as the place where these submarines will be constructed. Kure is on the inland sea, protected from direct American attack, at least for now. Kure is where the best workers in Japan can be found, where the craftsmen have the experience needed to build ships of unprecedented size and complexity. And Kure is where the secrecy can be maintained, because this project, from its very inception, is wrapped in layers of secrecy so complete that the men working on it often do not know what they are actually building. The workers arrive at the shipyard in the morning, and they work through the day, and if they notice something unusual about the structure they are assembling, if they see the enormous hangar taking shape, if they glimpse the unusual design of the pressure hull, they say nothing, they ask no questions. They are Japanese, and they are at war, and they understand what it means to be trusted with a secret. They understand that some things are not discussed, that some things are not spoken aloud even among friends, that the safest knowledge is the knowledge that remains unspoken, locked away in the mind, where it can harm no one. The moonlit swells of the Pacific know nothing of this yet. The ocean, vast and patient, continues its rhythms, continues its eternal motion, unaware that something so strange and ambitious is being built in its depths. But soon, very soon now, those swells will come to know something of what moves through them. Very soon, submarines carrying aircraft will slip beneath the surface of the sea, and the war will take on a new dimension, a new possibility, a new kind of terror that had never been imagined before. The question now becomes this: how do you create an aircraft that can fit inside such a boat? How do you design a plane that can be folded, that can be assembled in minutes on the surface of the water, that can carry a meaningful payload of bombs, that can reach a distant target, and that can do all of this while being as light and as compact as possible? The answer lies in a remarkable design project that begins even as the submarines themselves are being planned. The Aichi Corporation, one of Japan's preeminent aircraft manufacturers, is tasked with creating something that has never been created before. They must design an aircraft from the ground up with only one purpose: to fit inside the hangar of the I-400. The result? The water that night was breathing. That's what the sailors might have said if they'd been watching from the surface. The slow, patient rise and fall of the swells beneath a moon that seemed to rest just above the horizon, suspended and patient. But no one was watching. That was precisely the point. Down below, in the darkness where pressure mounts with every meter of descent, the I-400 lay waiting, her massive form cutting through the black like a thought moving through sleep. She was longer than a football field, heavier than any submarine had any right to be, and she carried a secret so strange, so improbable, that even her own crew sometimes struggled to believe what lived inside her steel hull. A submarine that could launch airplanes, not reconnaissance craft or observation balloons of the kind that submarines had attempted in earlier wars, but actual bombing aircraft, with wings that folded, engines that purred to life, payloads of explosives meant to rain down on distant targets from the sky. The contradiction of it all, this machine designed to hide beneath the waves, yet equipped to rise up and send wings into the air, makes you wonder what desperation, what audacity, what impossible dream could inspire such an invention. And that is precisely where we're going together now, into that world of contradiction and ambition, down through the layers of Pacific history, toward the men who built these boats and the vision that drove them forward, even as the war itself was collapsing around their feet. If you find yourself drawn to these quiet stories of hidden engineering and underwater ambition, of the forgotten chapters that submarines kept hidden in their hulls, you might consider subscribing to follow along with us through deeper waters still. Each documentary a descent into some corner of history that waited patiently in the dark, asking only to be remembered. The story we're about to unfold together spans nearly a decade of thinking, planning, and building. It moves through shipyards and admirals' offices, through the minds of engineers who had to solve problems that had never been solved before, through the daily routines of men who knew they were part of something extraordinary but couldn't speak of it to anyone, not their families, not their closest friends, not even to each other beyond the careful limits of operational necessity. It is a story of the Pacific War in its most ambitious and strangest form, told not through great battles or famous admirals' names, but through the slow accumulation of small decisions, secret meetings, and impossible technical achievements. The men who crewed these submarines were volunteers, though what volunteering truly meant in wartime Japan is a question worth sitting with. They were selected for their steadiness, their mechanical aptitude, their ability to work in confined spaces without losing their grip on reality or sanity. The I-400 and her sister vessels demanded a different kind of sailor than the conventional submarine service, someone who could maintain focus while working on machinery that had never existed before, who could trust in systems that had barely been tested, who could accept the possibility that they might be sent on a mission that could never actually be completed. The isolation of their duty was complete. They knew they were part of a special program. They could see the different proportions of their boat, notice the unusual machinery, feel the weight of secrecy in the air of every compartment. But the specifics were compartmentalized so thoroughly that you might stand next to a man for months and never truly know what you were both working toward. And here is where the story becomes almost dreamlike in its peculiarity. These submarines were meant to cross the Pacific Ocean, the entire Pacific Ocean, without stopping to refuel. They were designed with such enormous fuel capacity, with such careful engineering of every surface and angle, that they could theoretically travel from Japan to the coast of America and back again, all without surfacing for the long refueling operations that conventional submarines required. The range was almost science-fictional for the era, 12,000 nautical miles or more. The specifications grew larger and more ambitious with each design iteration. The submarine itself would be massive, over 300 feet long, displacing more tonnage than many destroyers. Inside her hull would be an entirely enclosed aircraft hangar, watertight and pressurized, with a catapult system to launch the airplane into the air. The plane would fly its mission, drop its bombs or whatever payload it carried, and then what? That question hung in the air like the planes themselves were meant to hang. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we move forward into the ambitions and the engineering challenges, let's breathe for a moment with the reality of what these boats actually were and what they were meant to do. The year was 1942, and across the Pacific, the war was reshaping itself like a living thing, learning to move in new directions. Japan had struck at Pearl Harbor just weeks before, and the reverberations were still rolling outward through military planning rooms in Tokyo, where men in high collars bent over maps illuminated by desk lamps that cast long shadows across their faces. The initial shock of that December morning had given way to something more complicated, a recognition that America, though wounded, was beginning to stir. And with that stirring came a question that haunted the minds of Japan's naval architects and strategists. How could an island nation, separated from its enemy by 5,000 miles of open ocean, continue to strike at the heart of American power? This was the world in which Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto moved, a man whose name had become synonymous with the audacious raid on the American fleet. Yamamoto was not merely a military commander, he was something rarer, a strategic dreamer with the authority to pursue dreams that seemed impossible to lesser minds. He had orchestrated the attack on Pearl Harbor, and he understood perhaps better than any of his peers that Japan's only advantage lay in speed, surprise, and the willingness to conceive of warfare in ways that others had not yet imagined. The war, as he saw it, could not be won through conventional naval engagements alone. America's industrial capacity was simply too vast, too resilient. What was needed was something that could reach where the enemy felt safe, something that could strike at the civilian will to continue fighting, something that could make Americans understand that their homeland was no longer inviolable. The Pacific itself, that enormous expanse of water, was both Japan's barrier and paradoxically its highway. What if that barrier could be crossed, not by surface fleets that could be detected and challenged, but by something that moved beneath the waves, unseen and unstoppable? What if a submarine, that most mysterious of warships, could be engineered not merely as a tool of commerce raiding or fleet support, but as a delivery system for aircraft, allowing Japan to strike at American cities, American infrastructure, American confidence, from a point so far away that retaliation would seem impossible? In the spring and early summer of 1942, this vision began to take concrete form in discussions between naval planners and the engineering divisions responsible for designing Japan's future warships. The concept was not entirely new. Various navies had experimented with submarines that carried aircraft in small numbers, but what Yamamoto and his allies envisioned was something of an entirely different scale. They wanted to build submarines so large, so capable, so audacious in their conception that they would be able to cross the Pacific, loiter near American shores, launch bomber aircraft against targets on the mainland, and then return home. The boldness of this thinking was almost otherworldly. In an era when submarines were generally thought of as solitary hunters, prowling beneath the surface for merchant ships or the occasional warship, Japan would create underwater aircraft carriers, floating fortresses that combined the stealth of the submarine with the striking power of naval aviation. The timing of this ambition is worth understanding in its full context. By early 1942, the war in the Pacific was still young, and while Pearl Harbor had demonstrated Japan's capacity for surprise, the broader strategic picture was becoming clearer to men who understood industrial mathematics. Japan could not outproduce America. It could not sustain a prolonged war of attrition. What it could do, perhaps, was use innovation and courage to shift the psychological dimensions of the conflict. If American civilians came to understand that no place was truly safe, that even cities on the mainland might be vulnerable to Japanese attack, might that not weaken the will to continue? Might that not create pressure for negotiation, for a settlement that would allow Japan to retain at least some of the territories it had conquered? This thinking was, one might say gently, built on assumptions that would not survive contact with American reality. But in 1942, as Japan still held much of East Asia and the Pacific, as its naval forces still commanded vast stretches of ocean, such thinking did not seem unreasonable to the men who held power. Yamamoto himself, despite his legendary caution about the ultimate prospects for war with America, threw himself into the planning with characteristic energy. He understood that the submarine carrier project was a long shot, a gamble, but in his view, Japan had few other cards left to play. The bureaucratic machinery of the Japanese Navy began to turn. Requirements were drawn up. Engineering challenges were identified and assigned. The Naval General Staff approved funds for the construction of submarines unlike anything the world had yet seen. There was, running through all of this planning, a note of both desperation and genuine innovation, the desperation of a nation that understood itself to be in a race against time, and the innovation that comes when constraints force minds to think in unorthodox ways. What would emerge from the shipyards would be the most advanced submarine design of the entire war, machines that would embody both the genius and the tragic limitations of Japanese military thinking in the middle years of the Pacific conflict. The ocean, vast and patient, waited for these machines to be built and to take to the water. And in the detailed specifications, in the calculations of ballast and buoyancy, in the careful engineering of a hangar that would sit atop a submarine hull, the seeds of a story were being sown, a story that would stretch from the drafting tables of 1942 all the way to the silent depths of the Pacific floor, where some of these incredible vessels would eventually come to rest. The Japanese naval strategists understood something that conventional military wisdom had not yet fully grasped, that the age of decisive sea battles fought between visible fleets was giving way to something far more subtle and far more terrifying. A submarine that could travel thousands of miles unseen, that could emerge from the depths at a chosen moment to deliver ordnance against targets miles away, represented a kind of warfare that rewrote every textbook. It was, in essence, the perfect marriage of two seemingly incompatible needs: the ability to cross oceans in secrecy, paired with the capacity to strike with genuine force. And that vision, that peculiar alchemy, is what gave birth to the I-400 class. Consider for a moment what a traditional bomber aircraft required: a runway, fuel depots, ground crews, infrastructure. All of these things announced themselves to the enemy. They were fixed, visible, vulnerable to reconnaissance and to retaliation. But what if an aircraft could be delivered to its launch point without any of that apparatus? What if it could be carried across the Pacific, concealed beneath the surface where no enemy eye could find it, and then released only at the moment of attack? The strategic advantage was almost immeasurable. The enemy would have no warning, no opportunity to intercept during transit, no way to locate the launching point until it was far too late. Admiral Yamamoto and the officers under him understood that Japan, as a maritime nation, lived and died by the sea. The American homeland felt impossibly distant, impossibly defended, but a submarine, a true submarine, not merely a platform for conventional attacks, but a vessel that could serve as a mobile airfield itself, that changed everything. It transformed the calculus of distance. It rendered conventional defenses almost meaningless. An aircraft launched from a submarine could strike targets that land-based bombers could never reach without relay and refueling. It could disappear back into the ocean, leaving no trace of where the attack had originated. This was not mere fantasy. The technology existed, though it was fragile and demanding. The engineering challenges were immense, yes, but they were not insurmountable. What Japan's naval architects recognized was that by removing the traditional constraints on how submarines operated, they could create something entirely new. Not simply a boat that attacked shipping, not merely a carrier of troops or supplies, but a weapon system unto itself, one that combined the stealth of the submarine with the range and destructive capacity of aviation. The strategic thinking extended into something almost poetic in its ambition. Imagine a submarine emerging at dawn somewhere in the vast, empty Pacific. Its hangar doors open with hydraulic precision. A floatplane, carefully folded and compressed, is unfolded on a catapult mechanism. The pilot takes his seat. The engine roars to life, muffled for as long as possible. And then, in the space of minutes, the aircraft launches. It has hours of flight time ahead of it, hours to travel to its target, to conduct its attack, to return. And when it does return, the submarine is still there, waiting, or has slipped away into deeper waters if necessary. The crew retrieves the pilot, closes the hangar, vents the compartments, floods the ballast tanks, and vanishes once more. From Tokyo's perspective, this represented a kind of warfare that could fundamentally alter the balance of power in the Pacific. The Americans possessed industrial superiority that Japan could not match. They could build more ships, more planes, more everything, but the submarine aircraft carrier, if properly executed, could make geography itself irrelevant. It could strike at targets protected by distance, targets that felt safe only because they seemed so far from any conceivable threat. And if Japan could operate several of these vessels simultaneously, the psychological effect on American civilian and military leadership could be profound. The thinking went further still. These submarines could theoretically make multiple voyages. A single vessel could carry not one, but several aircraft. After launching its first attack, it could remain in position or transit to a new location and launch again. The enemy would see isolated, seemingly unrelated attacks across vast distances and struggle to identify their source. There would be no frontal assault, no climactic sea battle. Instead, there would be the slow erosion of confidence, the creeping realization that nowhere was safe, that the ocean itself had become enemy territory. One must remember that in 1942 and 1943, submarine technology was advancing rapidly on all sides. The Germans had their U-boats, which had already demonstrated how a relatively small number of vessels could paralyze shipping across an ocean. But even the U-boats operated within limits. They depended on surface attack, on being able to see their target. What Japan envisioned transcended even that. It was submarine warfare with the teeth of aviation added to it. It was, in many ways, the ancestor of our modern understanding of asymmetrical warfare, using unconventional means to overcome a more powerful but less flexible opponent. The planners had observed how air attacks had changed naval warfare. Pearl Harbor itself was testimony to that fact. A handful of aircraft, properly launched and coordinated, could devastate a fleet. Now, imagine that same kind of destructive capacity married to the invisibility of the submarine. Imagine it applied not to a harbor or a fleet in formation, but to industrial centers, to fuel storage facilities, to cities themselves. The Americans had grown accustomed to their geographic isolation. They had built their entire defensive strategy around the assumption that the Pacific Ocean was barrier enough, that no enemy could project meaningful power across such distances. These submarines would shatter that assumption. There was something else at work in this strategic thinking, something almost desperate beneath the ambition. Japan knew, even in 1942, that time was not its ally. The longer the war continued, the more America's industrial capacity would reassert itself. Japan needed a tool that could strike decisively, quickly, and in a way that the Americans could not easily counter. A weapon that required no forward bases, no vulnerable supply lines, no fixed positions to be defended. A weapon that could be maintained in secret, developed in the shadows, and deployed at a moment of maximum strategic advantage. The submarine aircraft carrier represented, in essence, Japan's answer to a technological and logistical disadvantage that they could not overcome through conventional means. It was sophisticated, it was ambitious, and it was born from the precise moment in history when submarine technology and aircraft design had both matured enough to make such a combination theoretically possible. One can almost hear the calculations being made in quiet rooms in Tokyo. How many of these vessels would be needed? How quickly could they be built? What could they accomplish if they arrived off the coast of California or Panama with their aircraft ready to launch? It was a vision built on remarkable foresight, yet it was also a vision constrained by the very nature of warfare itself. Even submarines carrying aircraft were still submarines. They were slow compared to surface vessels, they were vulnerable in their own ways, and they depended on a level of synchronization and precision that wartime conditions made difficult to achieve. But those limitations would only become apparent as the program unfolded. For now, in the moment of conception, the I-400 class represented the ultimate expression of Japan's determination to strike back against an enemy that seemed, by every conventional measure, too far away and too well defended to touch. When Japanese naval engineers first unfurled the designs for what would become the Sentoku class, They were thinking in dimensions that simply did not exist in submarine warfare before. The very concept demanded a rethinking of what a submarine could be, not as a small, nimble predator, but as something closer to a mobile fortress, a vessel that would carry within its steel belly not just weapons, but the infrastructure of aerial combat itself. The scale they envisioned would have seemed almost impossible to those who had grown accustomed to the sleek, efficient submarines that had prowled the world's oceans through the early years of the war. The I-400 herself would stretch to nearly 400 feet in length, that is to say, longer than 3.5 tennis courts laid end to end. Her displacement would reach over 6,000 tons when submerged, a figure that made her not merely larger than her contemporaries, but genuinely in a category of her own. To understand the magnitude of this, consider that most of the submarines serving in the Japanese Navy at that time displaced between 2,000 and 3,000 tons. The American Gato-class submarines, which were themselves considered impressive vessels, displaced just over 2,000 tons. The I-400 was more than double that, a leviathan in steel that seemed to defy the conventional wisdom about what undersea vessels could accomplish. This immensity served a singular purpose. It had to provide the internal volume, the displacement, and the stability to carry aloft a specialized aircraft hangar. Not a small storage compartment for a reconnaissance seaplane, but a watertight, pressurized hangar large enough to house not one, but 2 folding aircraft, along with all the maintenance equipment, ammunition, bombs, and spare parts those planes would need for their missions. The designers understood that such a vessel could not behave like ordinary submarines. It would be slower, less agile, more vulnerable to attack from certain angles, but it would possess something no other submarine in the world possessed: the ability to project air power from beyond the horizon. The engineering solution demanded a hull shape unlike anything that had come before. Rather than the sleek, cigar-like form that submarine designers had favored for decades, the Sentoku boats had to accommodate a flat topside that could serve as the foundation for that aircraft hangar. This meant the pressure hull, the inner cylindrical core that would protect the crew from the crushing forces of deep water, had to be wrapped in an outer hull that created a vast upper deck. That upper deck, in turn, had to support not only the hangar structure itself, but also a catapult mechanism that would accelerate the aircraft to flying speed before launch. The structural integrity required to manage these forces while remaining seaworthy at high speeds was a monumental challenge for wartime Japanese metallurgy. Consider the hydrostatic pressures involved. A submarine that dives to significant depths experiences forces that increase exponentially with each meter of descent. The wider the hull's diameter and the greater its surface area, the more total force acts upon it. A vessel as large as the I-400 had to be engineered with extraordinary precision to ensure that no weakness in the welds, no thin spot in the plating, would allow the entire structure to implode. The margin for error was narrow, perhaps narrower than the designers would have preferred, given the time constraints and material limitations of wartime Japan. The propulsion system had to be equally remarkable. The I-400 was designed to use diesel-electric drive, diesel engines for surface propulsion and charging batteries, electric motors for submerged movement, but with increased horsepower to move such mass efficiently. She would generate over 5,000 horsepower on the surface, allowing her to cruise at speeds that would have seemed reckless for a submarine of her size and complexity. Underwater, she could achieve speeds exceeding 17 knots, speeds that gave her reasonable mobility despite her bulk. That mobility mattered because speed meant survival. A slow submarine lingering on the surface was prey. The I-400 had to be able to move swiftly to her operational area, perform her mission, and depart before enemy forces could converge on her position. Yet the hangar had to be ventilated and prepared while the boat was on the surface. The catapult mechanism had to be carefully set and armed. The aircraft had to be unfolded, fueled, and loaded with ordnance. All of this took time, precious, dangerous time, during which the submarine was vulnerable and immobile. The fuel capacity had to be extraordinary. The Japanese Navy had conceived of these vessels making round-the-world voyages, striking targets on distant coasts, and returning to port without refueling. To accomplish this, the I-400 would carry vast quantities of diesel oil in fuel tanks distributed throughout her hull. She would be designed to remain at sea for extended periods, her crew living and working in confined quarters, dependent on the careful rationing of oxygen, fresh water, and food to sustain them through weeks or months of solitary transit beneath the waves. The design specifications became almost dreamlike in their ambition, a range of up to 37,000 nautical miles, enough to circumnavigate the Earth's oceans, a diving depth of over 400 meters, placing her among the deepest diving submarines of the era. A crew of around 150 men, making her not merely a weapon, but a mobile community, a floating society organized with military discipline to function in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. She would carry her own water distillation systems, her own minimal hospital facilities, her own small library and record collection to maintain morale during the long, dark transits between missions. What emerges from these specifications is not merely a larger submarine, but a fundamentally different concept of what submarine warfare could be. The I-400 represented the culmination of a particular vision of naval strategy, one that saw the oceans as spaces to be crossed, enemy coastlines as targets to be struck from unexpected quarters, and the submarine itself not as a commerce raider or a convoy killer, but as a strategic platform for projecting power across the world's vast distances. She embodied a kind of ambition that transcended the immediate tactical concerns of the moment, a vision of what the Japanese Navy might accomplish if it could overcome the technical and engineering challenges that such a vessel presented. And yet, as these designs took shape on paper, as the blueprints became more detailed and more refined, the very enormousness of the I-400 began to reveal itself as both her greatest strength and her most profound vulnerability. In the calculus of submarine warfare, where stealth and agility often trumped raw capability, this gigantic vessel represented a gamble, a bet that the advantages of her unprecedented reach and her ability to project air power would outweigh the inevitable compromises that such size demanded. Time would begin to reveal whether that gamble was wise. Yet before those delicate aircraft could even be conceived, the engineers at Kure faced a problem that had never truly been solved before. How do you take something inherently fragile, an aircraft hangar with its vast open spaces and careful climate control, and seal it completely within a pressure hull meant to withstand the crushing force of the ocean itself? A submarine, at its essence, is a sealed tube. Every rivet, every seam, every connection must hold against pressures that increase with terrible mathematics as depth increases. One tiny flaw, one microscopic hairline fracture in the metal, and the entire vessel becomes a coffin sinking through darkness. This is the submarine engineer's constant, quiet dread. But a hangar is the opposite. It is meant to be open, airy, accommodating. It needs space for folding and unfolding, for maintenance, for the careful choreography of preparing an aircraft for flight. These two requirements, total hermetic sealing and functional accessibility, seem almost contradictory when you hold them in your mind at the same moment. The designers chose to place the hangar not below the main pressure hull, as one might expect, but above it, integrated into the hull itself. This meant that the pressure hull's upper surface would need to support not only the weight of steel, but the structural integrity of an entire secondary vessel. Picture it. A submarine is already a marvel of compression and efficiency. every cubic foot calculated, every ounce of weight justified. And now, atop that carefully engineered tube, they would build another structure, one that needed to open and close like a mouth, that needed to be watertight yet flexible, that needed to protect aircraft from the salt spray and corrosion of the sea, yet allow them to be launched into that very element. The hangar itself was perhaps 30 meters long and nearly 4 meters wide, a vast cavity in what should have been a streamlined form. Its roof was constructed of steel plates of varying thickness, designed to slide open and closed along a track system. The ingenuity lay in the sealing mechanisms. Where the roof panels met, rubber gaskets had to create an absolutely watertight seal, yet the weight and pressure of diving meant that these seals would be tested constantly, relentlessly. If even a few liters of seawater began dripping into that hangar during a deep dive, the pressure would force it in faster and faster, eventually creating a cascade of flooding that no pumping system could contain. The walls of the hangar were not simple sheet metal. They were carefully ribbed and braced, creating a structure that was as much sculpture as engineering. These ribs served a dual purpose. They distributed stress and pressure evenly across the surface, preventing the kind of catastrophic buckling that can occur when pressure acts unevenly on a curved surface. But they also created shadow spaces, corners where condensation could form, where the constant dampness of the sea air could work at the metal, grain by grain, year after year. The designers knew this. They knew that even with paint and careful maintenance, corrosion would be an endless battle, one that would never truly be won. Inside the hangar, the floor was a series of metal grates, through which seawater and condensation could drain downward toward collection sumps. These sumps then fed into pumping systems that would remove the water back out through the hull. It sounds straightforward enough, but in practice, it was a system requiring constant vigilance. If a pump failed, if the drain became clogged with rust or debris, water would begin accumulating. And water in a hangar during a combat dive is not merely an inconvenience, it is a slow, inexorable threat. The hatches and doors leading from the hangar into the main pressure hull needed to be equally sophisticated. They had to be large enough to allow aircraft components to be moved in and out, yet small enough that they could be individually sealed and reinforced. Each hatch had multiple locking mechanisms, rubber seals, and pressure checks. Opening a hatch during a dive required precise procedure. The pressure differential between the inside of the hangar, which would be equalized to depth, and the main compartment meant that opening a door would create a sudden rush of air and possibly water, a violent exchange that could knock a man from his feet. One of the more elegant solutions the engineers devised was a small observation port built into the hangar's starboard side. This was a thick piece of polished glass, reinforced with metal rings and sealed with multiple gaskets. Through it, a watch officer could peer into the hangar at any time without opening a major hatch, monitoring conditions and watching for signs of water intrusion or corrosion that might hint at future failures. It must have been strange to peer through that window into the dim, dripping interior of the hangar, knowing that beyond those steel walls lay the infinite weight of the Pacific Ocean, pressing in with the patience of stone against stone. The floor of the hangar also needed to accommodate a track system for moving the folded aircraft in and out through the main launch hatch. These tracks were precision engineered, their tolerances measured in millimeters, yet they had to function reliably in an environment of salt spray, high humidity, and constant pressure variation. Corrosion would seize these tracks, making them stick and bind. The engineers specified special alloys and protective coatings, but everyone involved in the project understood that this was an aspirational specification, that in reality, these tracks would need constant maintenance, constant coaxing, constant vigilance to keep them functional. The integration of the hangar into the main pressure hull also meant that the submarine's internal layout was unlike any that had come before. Passages and compartments had to route around and over the hangar space. The crew quarters, the torpedo rooms, the engine spaces, the battery compartments, everything had to be squeezed and rearranged to accommodate this massive intrusion. The I-400 would be far longer than any submarine built before her, but that extra length didn't translate directly into more comfort or more space for the crew. Much of that length was simply the accommodation of the hangar itself and the structural reinforcements needed to keep it watertight. There was also the question of pressure. When the submarine dived, the hangar would experience increasing pressure from all sides, crushing inward. To prevent collapse, the hangar needed internal bracing, but this bracing would take up valuable space that could otherwise be used for storing the folded aircraft or spare parts or ammunition. It was yet another compromise between competing demands, another knife's edge between barely sufficient and catastrophically inadequate that the engineers had to walk. Within that vast pressure hull, designed and refined across countless blueprints and meetings in flagships and naval ministries, there existed a singular, almost delicate problem that the Japanese engineers had to solve with ingenuity and precision. The hangar itself was merely an empty chamber, a cathedral of steel and silence meant to house something extraordinary. But what, precisely, would fly from those waters? The answer lay in a machine that seemed almost impossibly intricate for its purpose, the Aichi M6A Seiran, a floatplane bomber whose very design philosophy represented a marriage of compromise and ambition that would never quite be reconciled before history moved on. Picture, if you would, the challenge facing the designers at Aichi Aircraft Company in the spring of 1942. They were tasked with creating a warplane, not a reconnaissance bird, but an actual bomber, capable of carrying ordnance and striking targets with intention, that could somehow fold itself into a space roughly 36 meters long and 6 meters across. The hangar atop the I-400 was cavernous by submarine standards, yet impossibly constrained by the standards of aviation. A pilot's dream, perhaps, but an engineer's geometric nightmare. The Seiran that emerged from these constraints was something between a marvel and a compromise, a study in the art of deliberate reduction. It was not a large aircraft by the standards of any air force on Earth. Its wingspan, when fully extended, spread just over 12 meters. The fuselage, needle-thin and streamlined, measured less than 9 meters in length. The engine, a single Aichi Atsuta V12, liquid-cooled, produced modest power by the standards of fighters of its era, around 1,200 horsepower. This was not, in other words, a machine that could outfly or outfight the American interceptors it might encounter. It was something else entirely, a creature of stealth, of surprise, of the specific niche where surface vulnerability could be transformed into advantage. What made the Seiran remarkable was not its performance in a conventional aerial duel, but rather its peculiar adaptability to the role the Japanese had envisioned. The aircraft could be equipped with twin floats instead of a traditional landing gear, allowing it to alight upon open water and be recovered by its mother submarine, or it could carry a different configuration with wheels for land operations. It could haul bombs, up to 800 kilograms beneath its slim fuselage, or it could be fitted with photographic reconnaissance equipment for the intelligence missions that would become increasingly vital as Japan's strategic position deteriorated. Some variants would carry torpedoes slung beneath the wings, turning them into miniature anti-shipping weapons launched from the sky. But here lies the truly ingenious aspect, and one that consumed months of design iteration and testing. The Seiran had to fold, not disassemble into a dozen components requiring hours of patient reassembly, but rather collapse in a manner that was almost balletic, almost organic to the aircraft's design. The wings would swing downward from the fuselage in a scissoring motion, reducing the span from over 12 meters to just 3.5 meters. The tail fins could be retracted. The floats, which normally hung beneath the aircraft like ungainly pontoons, could be detached and stored separately. In this contracted state, the Seiran would occupy a footprint that could fit within the I-400's hangar without touching the walls. One imagines the first time this must have been demonstrated, perhaps on the airfield at Kure, or in a factory hangar somewhere in Japan's industrial heartland, the aircraft appearing to compress itself like some metallic origami, wings folding down with hydraulic hisses, surfaces sliding past one another with millimeter tolerances. The pilots and engineers who watched must have experienced a peculiar mixture of satisfaction and unease. The machine worked, yes, but there was something about the way it folded that spoke to its fundamental fragility, its existence as a compromise between two incompatible demands, the need to fly fast and effectively and the need to fit into a submarine. The construction of each Seiran began with those folding mechanisms as the central architecture. Every strut, every hinge, every connection point had to serve double duty. First, it had to support the stresses of flight, the vibration of the engine, the G-forces of maneuvers. But it also had to allow for that controlled collapse, had to accommodate repeated cycles of extension and retraction without metal fatigue overtaking the structure. The engineers opted for aluminum alloys throughout, despite their awareness that such materials were increasingly scarce in Japan's wartime economy. Strength and lightness were not luxuries in this design, they were necessities written in steel and calculation. By 1943 and into 1944, as the I-400 project moved from theoretical discussion into concrete construction, the Seiran itself was undergoing a parallel development. Production was necessarily limited. Never more than a handful of aircraft would be built. The submarines could not carry many, and the industrial capacity devoted to their manufacture was modest, a thin line of effort threading through Japanese aerospace production at a moment when every factory was stretched toward its breaking point. Some sources suggest that as few as 17 Seiran aircraft were ever completed, though other estimates place the number closer to 25. The exact count, like so much about the I-400 program, remains shrouded in the fog of wartime secrecy and the incomplete historical record. What is clear is that each aircraft represented an extraordinary expenditure of skilled labor, rare materials, and engineering attention. In a nation increasingly starved of such resources, each Seiran was a statement of commitment to an ambition that was becoming more desperate even as it was being realized. The aircraft were stored in hidden locations, some in factories, some in the submarines themselves, as construction neared completion. Pilots were selected and trained in secret. The machines were maintained with meticulous care, their folding mechanisms exercised regularly to ensure they would function when needed. Everything about them spoke of hope deferred, of plans made in 1942 that were being executed in 1944 and 1945 in a world that had changed almost beyond recognition. There is something poignant in contemplating these sleek, strange aircraft waiting in the shadows for deployment, their pilots prepared for missions that might never come, their carefully engineered mechanisms held ready for moments that might never arrive. They represented, in essence, the last gasping reach of Japanese naval ambition, the final attempt to create a weapon system that could strike at the American heartland, that could restore some measure of strategic balance to a war that had already tilted fatally away from Japan's hopes. The construction of the I-400 began in secret, as all things of consequence did in wartime Japan, and there was perhaps no place in the entire empire where secrets ran deeper than the Kure naval shipyard. Nestled on the inland sea, Kure had become by 1943 a vast humming landscape of steel and steam, where the Navy's most ambitious vessels took shape behind walls of secrecy that were less like barriers and more like the held breath of an entire city. The I-400 project, codenamed in some documents but never openly discussed, became part of a special section within the yard, a place where certain workers arrived through separate gates, where certain drawings were kept in locked rooms, and where conversations about what was being built simply ceased to exist the moment a supervisor approached. The submarine's hull, enormous and demanding, required a level of precision that pushed the yard's craftsmen to the edge of their capabilities. Unlike conventional submarines, which were built in relatively straightforward sections and welded together with a certain routine familiarity, the I-400 demanded something far more intricate. The hull itself would need to support not only the crushing pressures of the deep ocean, but also the structural demands of a watertight hangar mounted on its dorsal surface, a hangar that would house aircraft, which meant it required internal support beams, careful weight distribution, and angles of construction that hadn't been attempted before on this scale. The workers who bent the steel, who welded the seams with acetylene torches that threw sparks into the humid salt air, knew only fragments of what they were building. One man might know he was constructing a cylindrical section, another might understand only that this section required reinforced plating, a third might weld a bulkhead without ever knowing its true purpose. This compartmentalization, while it served the goal of secrecy, also meant that the work proceeded sometimes with a sense of mystery, even among those whose hands shaped it. The hangar itself presented engineering riddles that had never been fully solved before. How do you create a structure that is simultaneously part of a submarine's outer hull and an internal living space? How do you ensure that doors seal perfectly, that water pressure at depth does not slowly breach joints, that the internal mechanisms that opened and closed the protective casing functioned reliably after months at sea? The designers at the Naval Technical Arsenal in Tokyo had drawn up solutions, and the workers at Kure now had to translate those theoretical designs into welded steel. The hangar would stretch approximately 90 feet along the submarine's spine, rise roughly 11 feet above the pressure hull, and be covered by a retractable door mechanism that could be opened at the surface to deploy the aircraft and then sealed again as the submarine prepared to dive. The precision required bordered on the obsessive. Gaps measured in millimeters could mean the difference between operational success and catastrophic failure at depth. Around Kure, the shipyard expanded and contracted with the rhythms of the war. By 1943, when construction on the I-400 truly accelerated, the city itself had become a target. American bombing raids were increasing in frequency, and the night sky above the inland sea occasionally erupted with anti-aircraft fire and the distant crump of explosions. The I-400 project, however, continued almost as if insulated from the larger catastrophe unfolding around it. New protective structures were erected around the construction site, camouflage netting, wooden screens, deliberate architectural obfuscation designed to make the submarines blend into the forest of other vessels under construction. Workers arrived in the pre-dawn darkness, worked through the daylight hours, and departed as evening fell, speaking to no one outside their immediate work section about what they had done or built. There was a quality of fortress-like isolation to the entire operation, despite the fact that the yard itself was a vast, open place where thousands of workers moved between different projects. The secrecy was not merely a matter of military protocol, though that was certainly part of it. The I-400 represented such an extraordinary investment of materials, labor, and strategic hope that its existence became almost totemic within the Japanese Navy. Officers knew, in the highest echelons, that these submarines represented something unprecedented, a technology that, if deployed successfully, might yet strike at the American homeland in ways that conventional forces could not. And yet, paradoxically, the secrecy also bred a certain kind of isolation from accountability. The project proceeded with its own logic, consuming resources that might have been directed elsewhere, advancing through design and construction phases according to a timeline that had been set years earlier, even as the broader context of the war shifted beneath it. Did anyone at Kure truly ask themselves whether this enormous, complex submarine was the best use of their engineering talent and their nation's diminishing steel? Perhaps some did, in quiet moments, but such questions, if voiced aloud, would have constituted a form of doubt that military hierarchy could not tolerate. The workers themselves, thousands of them, from skilled welders and engineers to laborers and apprentices, inhabited a strange space between knowledge and ignorance. They could see that what they were building was immense, something unlike the conventional submarines that slipped out of the yard's dry docks on regular cycles. Rumors circulated, as they always did, about what purpose such a vessel might serve. Some whispered that it would carry special weapons, others that it would be used for espionage or reconnaissance, a few that it might somehow attack American shores. The official explanations, when they came at all, were vague. New submarine, advanced design, important strategic value. The compartmentalization meant that even senior workers at the yard might not understand the full scope of what was being created, only their discrete contribution to it. And yet there was, running beneath all of this, a strange current of purpose. These were men building something that their government and military leadership insisted was vital, that represented Japan's capacity for innovation and ambition even as the war turned increasingly against them. Whether they believed this, or whether they simply accepted it as the logic of their moment, is something the historical record does not quite clarify. The timeline of construction itself tells a certain story about priorities and desperation. The I-400 and her sister ships were laid down in the latter half of 1943, a moment when the war's trajectory was already visibly declining from Japan's perspective. The American island-hopping campaign was advancing through the Pacific. American industrial production was reaching staggering proportions, and the losses Japan had sustained in ships and trained pilots were becoming increasingly difficult to replace. And yet here, in Kure, workers were beginning the multi-year process of constructing submarines that would not be completed until 1944 and 1945, submarines that would require months of training and outfitting before they could even begin their missions. The faith embedded in this timeline is almost poignant, a belief that the war would continue long enough for these submarines to matter, that once they were ready, they would somehow alter the equation. The Kure Naval Shipyard, for all its massive industrial capacity, could not defy the mathematics of modern industrial warfare, but the I-400 project seemed to operate according to its own calendar, its own logic, its own quiet insistence that it would succeed because it had been ordered into existence. The men who would serve aboard these underwater giants came from across the Japanese Navy, selected through a process as secretive as the boats themselves. They arrived at Kure in small groups, never knowing quite why they had been chosen, never permitted to ask. The security surrounding the I-400 program was absolute. Sailors learned not to speak of their postings to family members, learned to offer vague explanations that dissolved into nothing should a letter be intercepted, and in wartime Japan, letters were always subject to scrutiny. The submariners who crewed conventional boats had already endured years of grinding danger. They knew the particular kind of courage required to descend into a steel tube while enemy destroyers circled above, searching with their sonar and their depth charges. But the men selected for the Sentoku class faced something different, a combination of technical mastery, physical endurance, and a willingness to operate in profound isolation, cut off even from their own military establishment's awareness. What does it mean to serve on a boat so secret that your own navy cannot speak of your existence? Perhaps it means accepting a kind of erasure, a peculiar loneliness that persists even in close quarters with hundreds of other men. Training for the I-400 crews began in 1943 and continued through the war years, conducted in the utmost secrecy at naval installations around Kure. The training was unlike anything in conventional submarine service. Pilots who would fly the Aichi Seiran from the hangar deck had to learn not merely to fly, but to conduct their entire sortie from a ship that would surface for perhaps 30 minutes at a time. They practiced launching, carrying out their bombing run, and returning to a moving target in the darkening ocean, over and over, in simulation and in dangerous live exercises. The pilots were among Japan's finest, pulled from the Naval Air Service at a moment when Japan could scarcely afford to lose such talent. Yet here they were, training for a mission that might never materialize, that might only be attempted once. The submarine crews themselves underwent drilling that was relentless and methodical. The officers, the commanders, the navigators, the engineering officers studied the I-400 blueprints until they could navigate her systems blindfolded, could respond to catastrophic flooding scenarios in the darkness of a damaged hull. The ratings, the enlisted men who would maintain the engines, manage the ballast tanks, cook in the minuscule galley, sleep in shifts in compartments so cramped that a man could lie down and touch both bulkheads, learned to move through the boat with an almost meditative precision. In a submarine, every motion must be economical. Every sound carries. Every mistake can cost lives. What was daily life actually like for these men, far from home, confined in a boat, designed to be nearly as large as a surface warship, yet as claustrophobic as a tomb? The I-400 was, by submarine standards, spacious. The crew numbered around 144 men at full complement. They had berthing spaces, however tight, a galley where the cook could prepare hot meals, a small crew's quarters where men might gather during rare moments of leisure. The air, though, was a constant challenge. Submarines of the era lacked modern ventilation systems. Air quality degraded as men breathed, as diesel engines burned fuel, as the boat's batteries, when submerged, produced their own chemical miasma. Over a long patrol, the air became thick and difficult. Men's thinking slowed. They grew irritable. The smell permeated everything. The distinctive odor of a submarine, a mixture of diesel fuel, human sweat, cooking oil, and something else less definable, perhaps the smell of fear itself, or simply of humanity pressed too tightly together in an artificial environment. The routine, once at sea, was regimented. Watch rotations ran in 4-hour cycles. A sailor might serve 4 hours of duty, then perform maintenance or cleaning, then sleep for a portion of the remaining 16 hours, then repeat. The watches were crucial. In the control room, the sound operator kept his ears pressed to the hydrophone receiver, listening for the distant rumble of propellers, the particular acoustic signature of an enemy destroyer or escort vessel. Any sound out of place could mean the boat had been detected. The navigator plotted position constantly, aware that any navigational error could mean missing a rendezvous point thousands of miles away, could mean running aground on an uncharted reef, could mean surfacing directly into the waiting guns of an American task force. For the men training at Kure, the awareness of secrecy was suffocating in its own way. They could not discuss their work with friends or family. They could not explain why they were being transferred. Some of the men who participated in the training would never actually sail on an I-400. They were part of a rotation, maintaining the fiction that this was a normal submarine program. But the men who would actually deploy on the boats carried the weight of knowledge. They knew what they were being trained for. They knew that they were part of something vast and desperate, a last gambit by a navy that understood, though few admitted it aloud, that the war was turning against them. The isolation of secret duty manifested in subtle ways. Letters from home were censored by special officers assigned to the program. Conversations about the boats were forbidden even within the enlisted ranks. A sailor might share a bunk with another sailor and never know what division that man served in, what his actual duties were. This compartmentalization was intentional, a security measure, but it also fostered a peculiar sort of loneliness. In peacetime, sailors formed tight bonds, communities within the larger military structure. But in the I-400 program, that community was fragmented, its members isolated from each other as much as from the wider world. And yet, despite the secrecy and the confinement, the men developed a kind of pride. They were part of something extraordinary, a project so ambitious that it required submarines larger than any yet built, submarines that could carry aircraft, submarines designed to project Japanese power across the greatest of oceans. Even as doubt accumulated in the minds of the more perceptive officers, even as the tide of war turned decisively against Japan, the crews maintained their training, maintained their readiness. What sustained them, one wonders? Perhaps it was the sheer weight of their commitment, the acceptance that they had been chosen for something momentous. Perhaps it was simply the discipline of military service, the habit of obedience and duty. Perhaps it was something less noble, the human tendency to adapt, to normalize even the most extraordinary circumstances, to wake each day and perform one's duties because that is what one has always done. The months of 1944 brought the men closer to their actual deployment. By that autumn, the boats were being completed, their aircraft hangars sealed and tested, their engines run and rerun. The pilots logged more hours in their Seiran aircraft. The engineering crews practiced emergency procedures with an intensity that suggested they expected to use them. The navigator officers studied the vast reaches of the Pacific, the routes between Japan and the distant targets that represented Japan's remaining hopes for changing the course of the war. And all the while, they moved through their days in a state of suspended animation, trained, prepared, ready, yet isolated from the larger conflict, unable to speak of what they knew or what they were becoming. The I-400 stretched 132 meters from stem to stern, a length that would have filled more than a city block if you laid it on dry ground. To put that in perspective, she was longer than a football field, longer than any destroyer escort the Allies possessed, and nearly as long as some of the light cruisers that patrolled the Pacific's shipping lanes. Yet all that immense length was compressed into a hull that displaced barely 5,000 tons when fully submerged. The designers had achieved something almost miraculous in their spatial calculations, a submarine that carried not just weapons, but an entire aerial squadron's worth of machinery and fuel, all housed within a pressure hull so slender it seemed almost fragile against the crushing depths. The range was the true marvel. Most submarines of the era, whether German U-boats prowling the Atlantic or earlier Japanese boats, could manage perhaps 8,000 or 9,000 nautical miles at an economical cruising speed before requiring a resupply. They were ocean-crossing vessels, certainly, but they were not truly intercontinental. The I-400, by contrast, possessed fuel capacity to traverse nearly 20,000 nautical miles without surfacing for supplies. 20,000. Let that sink slowly into your thoughts. That was a distance that would carry a submarine from the coast of Japan, across the entire Pacific Ocean, all the way to the California coast and back again. Or, if you preferred a different ocean, it would take her from Tokyo down around the Cape of Good Hope, across the Indian Ocean, through the Suez Canal if she dared, and into the Atlantic. The world itself, the entire circumference of the planet, lay within the operational reach of these machines, given enough time and careful fuel management. The engineers at Kure had designed the I-400 with 4 massive diesel engines that could push her through the surface at an impressive 18 knots, fast enough to pursue merchant ships or evade faster warships if necessary. But it was her underwater range that consumed the designer's attention. Submerged, running on electric batteries, she could travel at only 3 knots, a pace so slow it was almost meditative. But 3 knots, sustained for hours and hours, day after day, was sufficient. Time was something a submarine captain possessed in abundance. Distance could be covered through patience. The fuel tanks were distributed throughout the hull in a careful arrangement, nested between the pressure hull and the outer casing, tucked alongside the battery compartments, fitted into every possible void where liquid could be stored without compromising structural integrity. The engineers had learned from earlier submarine designs, from the trial and error of countless boats that had come before. The I-400 represented the crystallization of 15 years of Japanese submarine development, refined and expanded to its ultimate expression. Storage for the aircraft and their materials occupied a volume of nearly 300 cubic meters. That hangar space, that enclosed aircraft carrier nestled atop a submarine's hull, required its own electrical systems, its own ventilation network, its own drainage and pump systems to manage the inevitable seeping of seawater in the harsh depths. The submarine's main engines provided not just propulsion, but also the power for hydraulic systems that could raise or lower the hangar door, compressed air for all the mechanical functions, electricity for lighting and instruments. The I-400 was not simply a boat that carried planes. She was an entire floating workshop, a tiny shipyard, a mobile airfield that could remain hidden while her aircraft flew forth to strike at distant targets. The specifications on paper must have seemed almost absurd to admirals and captains familiar with conventional submarines. A boat this large, this complicated, this resource-intensive, and for what purpose? To carry just 2, or perhaps 3, aircraft on each patrol. A single fleet carrier could hold dozens of planes, could launch strike after strike. But therein lay the genius of the concept, or what appeared to genius before the war's circumstances changed everything. A conventional aircraft carrier required a vast support fleet, supply ships, destroyer escorts, fuel tankers. A carrier had to remain on the surface, vulnerable to radar and air attack. The I-400 could vanish beneath the waves. She could transit across oceans submerged, invisible, undetectable. She could arrive at her destination with her aircraft ready and fresh, her crew unexhausted, her position unknown to the enemy until the moment her Seiran bombers broke the surface and rocketed skyward. The fuel capacity, though, the fuel capacity invited grand strategic thinking. If a submarine could traverse the Pacific without refueling, then why not attempt something truly audacious? Why not strike at targets that no Japanese fleet had dared approach since the earliest months of the war? The Panama Canal sat 8,000 nautical miles distant from Kure, and while the fuel calculations were tight, while the margins for error were slim, the I-400 could theoretically make the journey. Her aircraft could approach the locks under cover of darkness, release their bombs and what? That was always the unspoken question. Return to the boat? Find a hiding place in the Caribbean? Make the long journey back across the Pacific? The practical details grew hazier the further one ventured into the planning, but the fundamental possibility existed, and that was enough to inspire the planners. In her final configuration, the I-400 and her sister boats were among the largest submarines ever constructed, surpassed only by the mammoth cruiser submarines that Germany had attempted and that France had experimented with in earlier eras. But those other boats had been trials, experiments, oddities that never quite fulfilled their strange promise. The I-400 was not a prototype. She was the first of a planned fleet, the vanguard of a new kind of naval warfare that Yamamoto and others believed could reshape the Pacific War. The numbers looked impressive on a drawing board. The range seemed adequate for the missions being planned. The fuel calculations, when done carefully by engineers who knew their craft, suggested that the impossible might actually be achievable. What nobody could accurately predict, in the quiet offices where these specifications were being drawn up, was how those numbers would translate when the war itself became something altogether different. The global conflict was not a static thing. It shifted and churned. Campaigns succeeded or failed. Resources became scarcer or more abundant. Strategic priorities transformed month by month. The I-400 was being built for a war that existed in 1942, while she herself would not be completed until 1945, and by then everything had changed. The Panama Canal, you might imagine, held a particular fascination for Japanese strategic planners in the early war years. It was not merely a waterway, it was the arterial valve through which American military power flowed between oceans, the narrow point upon which an entire industrial empire depended. And so, in the thinking of Admiral Yamamoto and those who served beneath him, what better target for a weapon so revolutionary, so secret, so capable of spanning vast distances undetected? To strike at Panama would be to strike at the very heart of American logistics. The concept took root sometime in 1942, when the war still seemed to favor Japan, when victories accumulated like tide pools along the vast Pacific expanse. The I-400 and her sister boats were conceived with this ambition already embedded in their blueprints. Imagine the strategic allure. A submarine, or perhaps 2 or 3 submarines, might depart from Japanese waters, travel beneath the surface for weeks, emerge near the canal zone under cover of darkness, launch their aircraft, and watch those delicate locks, the Gatun locks, the Miraflores, collapse into twisted metal and turbulent water. The Panama Canal was not merely strategic, it was symbolic. To sever it, even temporarily, would demonstrate that the American mainland itself was not beyond reach, that the vast Pacific could be traversed by Japanese will and Japanese steel. The mechanics of this plan reveal something fascinating about Japanese naval thinking. The I-400 would need to carry not just her aircrew, but also meteorologists, intelligence officers, and men trained specifically in the art of precision bombing from a floatplane. The Seiran, that elegant and secret aircraft waiting in its hangar, was equipped with specially modified bomb sights. Its wings would be extended once it emerged from the submarine. Its landing gear descended, and it would fly northwestward toward the canal, with the kind of low-level precision bombing run that Japanese aircrew had attempted elsewhere in the Pacific. Whether one aircraft or 2, whether one pass or multiple passes would be required, these details shifted in the planning documents that were guarded with almost religious secrecy. What is curious, when one reflects on these plans, is how they reveal both the ambition and the fragility of Japanese strategic thinking. The Panama Canal was roughly 6,000 nautical miles from Japanese home waters. A submarine traveling at modest underwater speeds to maintain stealth, then surfacing to launch aircraft, would need not only the structural sophistication of the I-400 class, which Japan possessed, but also a level of logistical coordination, weather prediction, and perfect timing that had rarely aligned in previous Japanese operations. And yet the planners pursued it. Perhaps this speaks to something deeper in warfare. Desperation, genius, and hope often look identical on paper. The submarines would carry spares for the Seiran, fuel reserves, and provisions for extended operations. The journey itself was conceived as a kind of deep-sea odyssey, though one undertaken in complete silence, with radio silence maintained, except for the most critical emergencies. The crews selected for these boats would be among Japan's finest. Submariners of proven courage, aircraft mechanics with years of specialized training, pilots whose skills in carrier operations had been honed during years of combat. These were not men sent on a suicide mission, though the danger was certainly understood. Rather, They were being selected for an operation of such precision and complexity that only the very best stood a reasonable chance of success. The specific mechanics of the launch phase were practiced repeatedly in the planning stages. The I-400, upon reaching a position deemed optimal by her captain and the aircraft commander, would surface carefully, her massive conning tower rising through the darkness. The hangar doors would be hydraulically opened, a process that took precious minutes and exposed the submarine to discovery. The Seiran would be wheeled out on its launching platform, its wings carefully extended, its flight checks completed. All the while, the submarine remained vulnerable on the surface, unable to dive quickly should enemy vessels appear on the horizon. It was during these minutes that the entire operation hung most delicately in balance. There existed, among the Japanese naval staff, considerable awareness that this plan, while technically feasible, was also fragile. A single American patrol aircraft, a chance encounter with a surface vessel, a miscalculation in weather patterns, any of these might unravel months of preparation. And yet the strategic payoff, in the minds of those who conceived it, justified the risk. The Panama Canal could not be easily repaired. Its closure, even for weeks, would cascade through American military operations, forcing a costly reorganization of the Pacific War effort. In some versions of the plan, multiple submarines would strike simultaneously, compounding the damage and the chaos. One wonders, listening to these ambitions now, what the pilots themselves thought when they understood their mission's scope. A flight across the Caribbean, toward one of the most heavily defended points in the Western Hemisphere, and then a return journey, either to a rendezvous point with the submarine, or, in more pessimistic scenarios, to whatever outcome awaited them in enemy territory. These men knew the war was turning against Japan by late 1943, when planning accelerated. They understood that this mission, if executed, might be among the final acts of Japanese aerial combat, a kind of swan song to conventional naval air power. The Panama Canal plan persisted in the Japanese imagination through 1943 and into 1944, even as circumstances around it shifted dramatically. The submarines themselves, meanwhile, continued their construction at Kure. The hangar doors became ever more refined. The Seiran prototype flew its test flights, and in the minds of planners working in Tokyo, the vision of those 4 massive I-class submarines carrying their aircraft across the world's largest ocean toward the American mainland remained alive, waiting only for the moment when the order would come to sail. The Japanese were not, it must be understood, alone in their fascination with the marriage of submarines and aircraft. Across the oceans, in the naval laboratories and war rooms of other nations, similar dreams had taken root and grown, each one reaching toward a tantalizing possibility. What if a submarine could carry its own wings? What if the depths could birth the sky? The British had begun thinking along these lines years before the Japanese seriously pursued it. In the 1920s and 30s, the Royal Navy conducted quiet experiments with what they called submarine-launched aircraft, small reconnaissance planes that could be assembled and launched from modified vessels. There was something almost poetic about the vision, a periscope breaking the surface at dawn, a folded seaplane rising from the deck like a bird emerging from its burrow, taking flight across hostile waters where no surface ship dared venture. The practical results, however, remained modest. The logistics of maintaining an aircraft at sea aboard a submarine, of protecting it from salt spray and the corrosive ocean air, of launching it safely without exposing the vessel too long to enemy eyes. These problems proved more stubborn than the dreamers had anticipated. The Italians, too, particularly during their years in the Mediterranean theatre, had pursued submarine aircraft combinations with varying degrees of seriousness. They understood, perhaps better than most, what it meant to operate in constrained waters, where every movement was watched, every ripple reported, An aircraft launched from an unseen submarine offered something precious: surprise, unpredictability, the ability to strike from a direction the enemy was not watching. Yet even the Italian Navy, clever and innovative though it was, never quite cracked the engineering challenge at scale. Small experiments, promising prototypes, but nothing that approached the ambition the Japanese would eventually embrace. The Germans, meanwhile, had pursued their own path. They recognized the theoretical value, but seemed to understand something the Japanese would later learn through hard experience: that submarines were at their most lethal, their most economical, when they remained hunters of opportunity in the depths, adding weight and complexity to the hull, creating a vulnerable hangar deck that caught water and wind, that required precious deck space and precious surface time to operate. There was a certain logic to the skepticism. The German U-boat captains, in their stark operational reports, seemed to ask, why complicate the machine when the machine itself is already so devastatingly effective? Yet the Japanese had looked at all of this: the British experiments, the Italian efforts, even the German caution, and they had seen something different. Perhaps it was the isolation of the Pacific that made them think this way. The distances were so immense. A submarine operating near the continental United States would have only a narrow window for action. An aircraft, launched from that same submarine, could penetrate far inland, could strike targets that the submarine itself could never reach. A dam, a shipyard, a city's defense infrastructure. In the Japanese mind, there was an elegance to it, a kind of poetry, the marriage of two technologies that should not, by any logical standard, belong together. The Americans, for their part, had conducted their own experiments, though with less urgency and less systematic commitment than the Japanese would eventually deploy. There existed a certain confidence in American shipyards, a belief that conventional submarines, used with tactical brilliance, would prove sufficient for any task the war might demand. And in many ways, they were right. The American submarine force would prove devastatingly effective using traditional methods. But there remained, in certain quarters of American naval thinking, a lingering curiosity about what might be possible if the constraints were removed, if resources were unlimited, if time were infinite. What if a submarine could do everything a submarine did, and also project power from the air? The difference, perhaps, lay not in the idea itself. Every major navy had entertained it in some form, but in the degree of commitment, in the willingness to pour vast resources into a gamble, to build not one experimental vessel but four, to design and manufacture an entirely new aircraft specifically to serve as its complement, to train men in wholly new procedures and protocols. The Japanese commitment was total. Where other navies had dabbled, the Japanese had decided to fully commit. And in that commitment lay both the source of the project's grandeur and, as history would eventually show, a kind of fatal overextension. One might wonder, drifting into contemplation on these matters, whether such ambitions, such extraordinary technical stretches toward the impossible, emerge most powerfully from a particular kind of necessity. A nation with abundant surface vessels and secure trade routes might never feel driven to imagine submarines with hangars. But a nation facing enemies at vast distances, a nation that could no longer compete in conventional naval power, a nation whose coastlines were increasingly threatened, such a nation might look up at the sky and down at the water and see, suddenly, a possibility where others saw only complication. By the time the Japanese truly committed to the I-400 program, the naval experiments of other nations had already provided them with a kind of map, a sense of what had been attempted, what had failed, what remained theoretically possible. They would take that map and follow a road that no other nation had traveled quite so far, with quite such singularity of purpose. They would build their underwater aircraft carriers not because no one else had thought of it, but because they were willing to pay a price that no one else seemed prepared to invest. And in doing so, they would create something that was, quite simply, without peer. By the time the hulls of the I-400 and her sister boats began to take their final shapes in the shipyards of Kure and Sasebo, the war that had once seemed to flow entirely in Japan's favor had begun, almost imperceptibly at first, to turn. It was a shift so gradual that those working in the secret hangar bays might not have fully grasped its meaning until months had passed, until the reports filtering down through the naval hierarchy grew quieter, more urgent, less optimistic. The year was 1944, and across the Pacific, something fundamental had changed in the balance of forces. In the years before, Japan's reach had seemed almost limitless. The victories of 1941 and early 1942 had carried an intoxicating sense of inevitability, as though the empire's expansion would continue unimpeded into regions that had seemed, for so long, beyond the horizon. Pearl Harbor had shattered one myth, that the American fleet was untouchable, and the rapid conquests that followed had seemed to confirm another, that Japan's newer tactics, its superior naval aviation, its willingness to venture into strategies others deemed impossible, would sustain its position of power. But by 1944, the mathematics of industrial capacity and human endurance had begun to reassert themselves in ways that no amount of ambition could overcome. The American shipbuilding industry, which had seemed almost theoretical in the abstract certainties of Tokyo's strategic planning, revealed itself to be something far more concrete and overwhelming. For every vessel Japan lost, it seemed that 3 more appeared on the horizon, built in the vast yards of Newport News and the San Francisco Bay. American pilots, once written off as inferior, had learned quickly, adapted ruthlessly, and grown into a formidable corps. The losses of trained Japanese airmen at places like the Marianas, where in a single catastrophic engagement, the best of the fleet's aviators were lost, could not be replaced. The pipeline of new pilots, once robust, had thinned to a trickle. And the replacement aircraft, increasingly rushed into production, lacked the refinement and capability of the designs they were meant to augment. For Admiral Yamamoto, the man who had conceived of the I-400 project in the first place, none of this was theoretical. He had understood, perhaps better than anyone in the Japanese high command, that the war was a race against the clock. He had known, had in fact said so quite plainly to those who would listen, that Japan had, at best, a year to achieve a decisive victory, after which the weight of American production would render victory impossible. His insight had been disturbingly accurate, but Yamamoto himself would not live to see the completion of the submarines he had envisioned. He died in the spring of 1943, shot down over Bougainville in an ambush that some whisper was no accident at all. The man who had championed the I-400 project was gone, yet the submarines that carried his name in their strategic DNA continued to grow in the shipyards, indifferent to the loss of their patron. What happens to a strategic vision when the man who conceived it disappears? Perhaps the project simply acquires a momentum of its own, continuing forward because to stop it would require an acknowledgement that the entire premise had shifted. The original mission, to strike the American mainland, to bomb the Panama Canal, to demonstrate that no corner of the enemy's world was safe, began to seem less like brilliant strategy and more like an increasingly desperate gamble. Yet resources continued to pour into the project. Men worked in those secret hangar bays. Steel was shaped and welded. The Aichi Seiran floatplanes were built and rebuilt until they could fit, folded and compact, within their aluminum cradles. What conversations must have taken place in those offices where strategy was discussed and revised? We can only imagine the slow, aching recognition that the war was no longer being won, that the initiatives of 1942 and 1943 had not yielded the decisive breakthrough everyone had hoped for. Perhaps there was a kind of stubborn resistance to the inevitable. a refusal to abandon plans that had absorbed so much effort, so much secrecy, so many resources. Perhaps those directing the I-400 program still believed that a well-executed strike, delivered from an unexpected quarter by a weapon of unprecedented scope, could somehow alter the trajectory of events. Or perhaps, in quieter moments, they knew that they were simply maintaining the pretense of offense, while the deeper truth was one of survival, of trying to inflict one last meaningful blow before the end came. The Philippines fell in 1944. Saipan fell. The Marianas were lost. Each of these losses represented not merely the cession of territory, but the demonstration of a fundamental shift in military capacity and will. American ships, American men, and American industrial power were now flowing into the Pacific in quantities that made prior achievements seem almost quaint. The B-29 Superfortress, that enormous new bomber, was beginning to emerge from American factories. The range of American naval aviation was extending with each new type of aircraft and each new technique of fleet refueling that extended the reach of the task forces. In 1944, the question was no longer whether Japan could win the war. Somewhere, in boardrooms and strategy conferences throughout the military hierarchy, the terrible realization must have taken hold. The question was only how long Japan could sustain the fight, and whether, in those final months or years, there might be some gesture, some dramatic act, that could somehow alter the terms of surrender. The I-400 submarines, massive and secret, and carrying within their hulls the promise of a capability no enemy had ever possessed, began to seem less like the hammer blows of an ascending power and more like the final, desperate gambit of an empire that was running out of time. The war's momentum, which had seemed so entirely in Japan's favor in 1942 and even into 1943, was now running entirely the other way. And yet the submarines continued to be built, the plans continued to be refined, the crews continued to be trained, because once an ambition of that magnitude has been set in motion, it is not easily halted, even when the circumstances that gave rise to it have fundamentally changed. Even when the very reason for the weapon's existence seems to have slipped away into history, the weapon itself continues to take shape, waiting for the day when it might finally venture into the world and reveal what it was capable of doing. The keel of I-400 was laid at the Kure Naval Shipyard on the 15th of January 1943, in a moment that few people beyond the naval hierarchy would ever know had transpired. The war by then had already begun its slow turn, though the officers charged with her construction could not quite admit it to themselves. For 3 years the Empire had swept across the Pacific, yet the Americans continued to build, continued to adapt, and somewhere in that gap, between what Japan had lost and what it might still achieve, the I-400 took shape in the darkness of the wartime shipyards. The work was meticulous and endless. Imagine the sound of it, the rhythmic pulse of riveting hammers echoing across the water at all hours, the screech of metal on metal, the muffled shouts of supervisors whose voices carried the strain of a nation pushing every resource toward one more gamble, one more machine that might turn the tide. The shipyard workers, many of them conscripted or transferred from other projects, labored in shifts that blurred into one another. Security was absolute. No photographs were permitted. No loose talk was tolerated. Even within Kure itself, where naval construction had been an open affair for decades, the I-400 section of the yard was cordoned off, guarded by naval police, isolated from the rest of the base like a secret growing in plain sight. The submarine's construction proceeded through the middle years of the war with a kind of stubborn purposefulness, even as the strategic situation deteriorated around it. By late 1943, Japan had begun to lose more than it could replace. The carriers that had struck Pearl Harbor were gone. The pilots who had trained in peacetime were gone. Yet in the shipyards, the work continued. The hull plates were welded into position, section by section. The massive pressure hull was tested, hammered, tested again. The aircraft hangar, that extraordinary novelty, rose from the deck like nothing any submarine engineer had attempted before. A sealed chamber, atop the boat itself, capable of holding floatplanes, sealed against the crushing pressure of the ocean depths. How many of the workers wondered, one imagines, whether this machine they were building would ever be finished? Whether, if it were finished, it would ever matter? I-400 was launched on the 30th of December, 1944. The ceremony was subdued compared to the great launches of earlier years. There was no cheering crowd, no champagne christening, no bands playing patriotic songs for the newspapers. The war had grown too desperate for such displays. Instead, there was simply the mechanical process of releasing the hull into the water, the moment when the submarine shifted from being an inert collection of steel to being a living vessel, buoyant and dangerous and real. The water that held her now would be her element for as long as she existed. Fitting out continued through the winter and into the spring of 1945. The boat was towed to different sections of the yard as her systems were installed: the engines, the periscopes, the torpedo tubes, the hydroplanes. The crew began to arrive in small numbers. Officers first, then the enlisted men. Some of them had trained on conventional submarines. Some had been pulled from shore duty or from other branches. They were young, mostly, as submarine crews always were. What did they think, one wonders, when they first saw this enormous vessel they would be expected to master? When they climbed through the hatches and walked through the narrow corridors and stood in the control room, comprehending the sheer complexity of the systems they would need to operate. By April of 1945, I-400 was commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy, officially and formally. There was a ceremony, though by then, such ceremonies had taken on a different character. Japan itself was being bombed into rubble. The American forces were island-hopping their way steadily closer to the homeland. The Navy had been decimated. The loss of trained personnel had reached catastrophic levels. And yet, here was I-400, fully functional, fully armed, representing an investment of resources and ingenuity that no longer made strategic sense. Her sister boats followed. I-401 was launched and commissioned. So too was I-402. A fourth boat, I-13, had been converted from a conventional submarine into a similar configuration, though less elegantly than the purpose-built Sentoku-class vessels. There was even a fifth boat planned, I-404, though by the time her keel was laid, the situation had deteriorated to such a degree that her completion seemed almost a matter of ritual rather than military necessity. The men who crewed these submarines were aware, at some level, of how desperate their situation had become. The cities around them were burning. The Americans were within striking distance. The war was now being fought on Japanese soil in a way it never had been before. And yet the I-400 and her sister boats were being prepared for operations, readied for missions, equipped with fuel and supplies, as if there remained any possibility of using them effectively. What strange psychological space must the crews have inhabited? Knowing perhaps that their vessel was a marvel, a unique achievement in naval engineering, yet also sensing that this marvel might arrive too late to matter, might be sent out on a mission whose outcome was already written. The secrecy that had surrounded the I-400 program did not dissipate when the boats were commissioned. If anything, it deepened. The crews were isolated, kept separate from the rest of the Navy, briefed only on the bare minimum of information they needed to perform their duties. The hangar and its aircraft were kept under heavy guard. The fuel storage areas were restricted. It was almost as if, one might reflect, the Japanese Naval Command was trying to preserve the secret of these submarines even as the war itself was becoming a secret that everyone already knew, that no one needed to guard anymore because the outcome had already been decided by mathematics and geography and the simple calculus of industrial production. And so the I-400 class submarines existed in that strange liminal space of the spring of 1945, fully realized, fully commissioned, yet somehow already belonging to history rather than to the immediate present. They were weapons without a war that made sense to deploy them in. They were the last great gamble of a nation that was no longer in a position to gamble. They floated in the harbors and the bases, marvels of engineering and determination, waiting for orders that would have to reckon with a reality that was shifting hour by hour, day by day, toward a conclusion that none of the men involved could quite bring themselves to articulate aloud. By the time the I-400 and her sister boat, the I-401, had finally slipped into the grey waters of the inland sea and begun their training operations in the spring of 1945, the world the Japanese Navy had known was already becoming something else entirely. The original dream, you see, that grand vision of striking the Panama Canal, of paralyzing American logistics from within, of forcing a negotiated peace through a sudden cascade of catastrophic surprise, that dream had withered. The war had moved in directions no admiral had quite anticipated, and with each passing month, the strategic map kept shifting, kept narrowing, kept drawing the circle tighter around the home islands themselves. By April, by May, the planning committees and the naval strategists understood something they had perhaps been reluctant to admit. The I-400 submarines would not be sailing across an ocean highway they controlled. They would be threading their way through waters increasingly patrolled, increasingly dangerous, where every surface and every depth held the potential for swift, silent destruction. And so the mission changed. It had to. What had once been a carefully prepared transcontinental strike was reformulated into something more immediate, more pressing, more desperate in its own quiet way. The target became Ulithi Atoll. You might pause, as a listener, and wonder what made this particular sprawl of coral and shallow water significant enough to redirect two of the most sophisticated weapons in the Imperial Japanese arsenal. But Ulithi was no ordinary anchorage. It was, in effect, the floating city of the American Navy in the Pacific. Since the American advance had pushed westward, claiming island after island in their systematic island-hopping campaign, Ulithi had become something like the nerve center of the entire naval effort, a protected lagoon where hundreds of American ships could rest, refuel, repair, and resupply without the threat of a major surface engagement. Destroyers, cruisers, fleet carriers, escort carriers, transport ships, tankers, repair vessels, ammunition barges, all crowded together in that turquoise water like metal birds gathered at a watering hole. The intelligence that reached the Japanese command structure was vivid and by and large accurate. Ulithi held as many as 700 vessels on certain days, though that number fluctuated with the operational tempo. Somewhere between 50 and 100 combat ships might be present at any given moment, a concentration of American naval power so dense, so vulnerable to air attack, that it almost seemed to invite the kind of intervention the Seiran bombers could provide. The mathematics were seductive, weren't they? 2 submarines, each carrying a pair of fast, agile, single-engine bombers that could be launched with minimal warning, attack the anchorage with surprise and precision, and then, theoretically, vanish back into the vast Pacific before any meaningful counterattack could develop. A raid, a sting, a demonstration that the Americans, despite all their advantages, were not immune to Japanese innovation and audacity. This redirection of purpose happened quietly, almost without fanfare, in the command structures at Tokyo. The I-400 and I-401 had been designed and built for a specific, almost mythological objective: to strike at the enemy's heartland, to project power across half an ocean, to reshape the course of the war through a single, brilliant maneuver. Now they would be asked instead to dive into contested waters with a tactical mission, with an objective that, while undoubtedly significant, lacked the grandeur of the original vision. Was this disappointment voiced among the officers who had championed the program? Perhaps. But by May 1945, there was little time for regret. The war was collapsing. The American advance had stalled somewhat in the face of fanatical Japanese resistance in the Philippines and at Okinawa, but the trajectory was unmistakable. Germany had already surrendered. The only question that mattered now was how the Pacific War would end and on what terms. The Ulithi mission was codenamed Operation Hikari, which translates as Operation Light. There is a certain poetry to that choice of name, you might think. The idea of bringing illumination, of shining forth, of making one's presence known. But the operation also carried the weight of desperation, the sense that this might be one of the last opportunities for the Japanese Navy to strike a significant blow. The commanders who would oversee the preparation of the I-400 and I-401 began working with heightened urgency. Every hour mattered now. The submarines themselves had to be made ready, their crews trained to handle the launch procedures for the Seiran aircraft, the timing sequences, the coordination between submarine and aircraft that would need to be flawless in order for the mission to succeed. And the pilots who would fly the Seirans, they had to be selected, briefed, drilled in the attack patterns that would maximize their chances of striking meaningful targets within the anchorage before the American air defenses could respond. Think for a moment about what this meant in practical terms for the men involved. The submarine crews had already trained extensively on the I-400 and I-401. They understood every compartment, every system, every peculiarity of these extraordinary vessels. But the addition of an airstrike component added a new layer of complexity, a new set of rhythms and requirements that had to be integrated into the submarine's operations. The aircraft themselves had to be maintained in their sealed hangar, protected from the salt spray and the damp, ready to be erected and fueled at a moment's notice. The pilots had to be able to climb from the submarine's cramped quarters into aircraft that had been folded and stored in a space barely larger than a long closet. They had to coordinate with the submarine's surface emergence, with the hydraulic systems that would unfold the wings, with the catapult preparations that would hurl them into the air with enough speed to achieve flight. This was not, you understand, a matter of simply pointing the submarines toward Ulithi and wishing them well. The operation required genuine sophistication. The approach would need to be carefully planned. The submarines would have to transit through waters where American patrols were known to operate, the seas around Okinawa, where the fighting was still fierce, where aircraft and destroyers hunted submarines with increasing effectiveness. They would need to surface at night to raise the aircraft and conduct their launch operations, and this was perhaps the most vulnerable moment of all. A surfaced submarine is almost helpless. The hangar doors would have to be opened. The Seiran bombers would have to be erected from their folded configuration, their wings extended, their engines warmed, their fuel tanks filled, all of this taking precious time, all of it visible to any searching eyes. Once the aircraft were launched and climbing toward Ulithi, the submarines themselves would need to dive deep and move away quickly, seeking the safety of darkness and depth before any American response could locate them. The planning documents that survive from this period suggest a certain optimism, or perhaps a necessary act of will toward optimism, among those who were overseeing Operation Hikari. Yes, the situation was dire. Yes, the American forces vastly outnumbered anything Japan could field. But if this strike, this single sudden blow against Ulithi, could be delivered with precision and surprise, could inflict significant damage on American warships and logistics, then perhaps, just perhaps, It might create a moment of opportunity, a pause in the American advance, a window in which some kind of negotiated settlement might be possible. This was not, at its heart, different from the hopes that had motivated the construction of the I-400 class from the very beginning. It was simply the same dream, refined and focused and concentrated into a single, desperate objective. The ocean in early summer of 1945 was no longer a highway for the Japanese Navy. It had become a gauntlet of shadows and steel. American submarines prowled the waters in patterns that the Japanese strategists had long since come to understand, and yet understanding and evading them were two very different matters entirely. The I-400, having slipped from her moorings at Kure in late June, carried within her hull not only her crew but also the weight of an empire's fading hopes, and the men who worked her passage knew this in the tightness of their shoulders and the careful deliberation of every command. The voyage south and east toward Ulithi required what submariners called a ghost transit, moving through contested waters by night when possible, submerged by day, using every fold of the ocean and every reading of the thermocline to avoid detection. The captain would stand in the coming tower and listen to the water itself, to the distant pulse of destroyer propellers and the rare, terrible sound of sonar pinging across the depths like the cry of some vast mechanical whale. The men below, arranged in the cramped corridors of that mammoth hull, understood that they were traveling through what amounted to an enemy sea, though the term enemy was becoming increasingly abstract in those final weeks of conflict. Japan's military situation had deteriorated so completely that the very concept of victory had shifted from conquest to something far more modest. Survival, perhaps, or the delivery of at least one meaningful blow before the inevitable came. The I-class submarines, including the I-400 and her sister boats, maintained strict radio silence during their passage, receiving only the barest transmission of coordinates and orders through channels so encrypted and so infrequent that sometimes days would pass with no communication at all. The captains navigated by dead reckoning, by star sights taken through the periscope during those dangerous moments when the boat rose to depth to observe the heavens, and by the accumulated knowledge of ocean currents and the seasonal patterns of weather that had been passed down through generations of Japanese mariners. Have you ever considered what it might mean to navigate an ocean without the ability to speak, to ask for clarification, to do anything but move forward on faith and mathematics? The water itself, in those latitudes, was beginning to warm with approaching summer, and this brought both advantage and peril. The warmer currents created thermal layers that could bend sonar beams and confuse pursuing vessels, but they also meant that the submarines had to descend deeper to find the colder water where they might hide. The I-400, with her bulk and her draft, required particular skill to manage these transitions, and her engineering officer would work carefully with the chief of the boat to trim the vessel so that she sank and rose without the telltale sounds that might betray her presence to the delicate ears of the American listening devices scattered across the Pacific. The men aboard had grown accustomed to a peculiar rhythm of tension and monotony. Hours, and sometimes entire days, would pass with nothing but the hum of the electric motors, the soft tick of metal contracting and expanding, the occasional creak of the pressure hull as the boat descended or rose. Then, without warning, would come the alert, a lookout in the conning tower spotting the smoke of a passing merchant vessel, or, more dangerously, the escort destroyers that American convoy commanders had stationed across the shipping lanes. In such moments, the boat would dive, and everyone aboard would move with practiced economy, their voices dropping to near whispers, their movements slow and deliberate, as though the American listeners above might somehow hear a footstep or the soft shuffle of a man shifting his weight. One might wonder what thoughts occupied the minds of these submariners during the long, quiet hours beneath the waves. Some kept journals, though the pencil on paper had to be done by the dim red light that submarines used below deck to preserve night vision for the moments when men might have to surface. Others simply sat in their hammocks or at their stations and thought of home, of wives and children and elderly parents, all of whom had likely heard by now, or would hear very soon, that Japan's defeat was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability that had already begun to unfold. The war's end was not yet official, but every officer and every experienced sailor understood that they were traveling through the epilogue of something vast and terrible, and that whatever happened in the coming weeks would amount to little more than notation in a history that had already been written by forces far larger than themselves. The route to Ulithi took the I-400 through some of the most heavily patrolled waters in the Pacific, and there were incidents, close approaches to American task forces, moments when sonar contacts were made and the submarine's captain had to make the instantaneous calculation of whether to dive deeper, to change course, or to hold position and hope that the American operators would dismiss the contact as nothing more than a whale or a current anomaly. The distance to the target was not so great, but the time required to cover it stretched and stretched, as though the ocean itself were reluctant to cooperate with the submarine's mission. Days became nights, and nights became days, marked only by the change of watch and the slow consumption of the boat's canned provisions, which, even for officers, amounted to little more than rice balls and the occasional bit of dried fish. The men had learned to move through the I-400 with an almost dreamlike efficiency, navigating the narrow passages and the vertical ladders that connected the compartments without making the kinds of sounds that might carry through water to an anxious listener above. There was something almost meditative about it, the way that long submarine voyages tended to compress consciousness into the present moment, stripping away the distractions of land-based life and leaving only the boat, the water, the coordinates, and the unspoken understanding that they were all dependent upon one another in a way that few human endeavors actually demanded. And yet, even as the I-400 and her sister boats pressed forward toward their objective, events were unfolding in the world beyond that ocean that would soon render their mission moot. Might it be possible that somewhere in the complex machinery of naval command there were officers who suspected this, who wondered silently whether the mission they had been ordered to execute would ever reach completion, or whether the war itself would simply cease before they could arrive? The war that had consumed every waking moment, every calculation, every carefully rationed breath of diesel fuel, ended not with a triumphant return, but with a single radio message crackling through the humid air of a submarine's control room on August 15th, 1945. Somewhere in the vast Pacific, thousands of miles from home, the men aboard the I-400 and her sister boats received the news that Japan's government had accepted the Potsdam Declaration unconditionally. The emperor himself, a voice most had never heard, had spoken on the wireless in formal court language, announcing that the war had not turned in Japan's favor, that to continue would only bring greater calamity upon the people. One imagines the silence that followed in those submarine compartments. The crew had been at sea for weeks, submerged and waiting, their final mission, whatever it might have accomplished or failed to accomplish, suddenly rendered obsolete by a single transmission. There was no explosion, no final battle, no heroic last stand. There was only the hum of the electrical systems and the weight of understanding that everything they had sacrificed toward, every grueling hour of training, every moment of fear and discipline and isolation, had culminated not in victory but in defeat announced by their sovereign, filtered through a radio speaker, and received in the dimming light of a coming dusk beneath the surface. The captains of these vessels, men trained in the imperial tradition to never accept surrender, to fight to the last breath, faced a peculiar kind of paralysis. What does one do with a weapon that has never struck its intended target? What does one do with a submarine full of men, far from home, when the nation that sent them has capitulated? There was no precedent in their training for this moment. The protocols of war, which had governed every action and decision since that first dawn at Pearl Harbor, suddenly no longer applied. In their place came something far more uncertain, the protocols of surrender, of shame, of homecoming without victory. Commanders were forced to weigh their options with what little radio communication remained intact. Return to Japan, but the waters around the home islands were surely crawling with Allied destroyers and patrol craft, waiting for exactly this moment, when submarines might attempt to come home. The I-400 and her sisters were valuable, even in defeat, perhaps especially in defeat. They might be captured, their secrets exposed, their technology dissected and analyzed by the Americans. A captain might choose to sink his own ship rather than allow that indignity. This dark thought must have crossed the minds of several commanders as they considered what came next. Yet for most, the choice, though terrible, was clear. They could not sink their own vessels without clear orders, without confirmation of what was being asked of them. They could not order their men to die when the Emperor himself had decreed that further death was unnecessary. The anticlimactic nature of it all, no final glory, no moment of triumph or sacrifice, only a radio message and a new uncertainty, must have felt somehow worse than any conventional defeat. In war, there is at least clarity. In surrender, there is only the murky confusion of what happens now. The crews, particularly the younger men who had never known peacetime, began the strange transition from combat readiness to a kind of holding pattern. Orders came to proceed to designated rendezvous points, to await further instruction. The submarines would not fight their way home. They would not attempt any last desperate mission. They would simply sail, keeping silent, moving through waters that no longer belonged to them, toward a future that no longer belonged to anyone who had planned it. What must it have felt like in those compartments, in those tight metal corridors where men had lived for months in suffocating proximity, breathing recycled air, eating canned provisions, sleeping in narrow bunks stacked 3 high. The war had given them purpose, terrible and absolute though it was. They had served something larger than themselves, the Emperor and the Empire, and that had meant something even when it meant death. Now that purpose had evaporated. They were simply men in a submarine, waiting to be told what to do next, and the silence of that waiting must have seemed louder than any torpedo alarm. Some crews maintained discipline and routine. Others fell into a kind of stunned passivity, going through the motions of keeping their vessel operational without any real conviction that there was a point to doing so. There was no celebration, no relief, despite the end of hostilities. How could there be? They had lost. Japan had lost. The divine victory that propaganda had promised, that military doctrine had guaranteed, had never materialized. The impossible dream of striking at the heart of America, of forcing a negotiated peace from strength, this had become simply impossible, and now it was moot. What happens to the spiritual and psychological framework of men who have been trained to believe in absolute victory, in the unconquerability of their cause, when that cause is revealed to be utterly conquered? It is a disorientation that conventional histories sometimes gloss over, moving quickly past the moment of surrender to the logistics of what came after. But those quiet days at sea, cruising at reduced speed through empty waters, waiting for instructions that would transform their lives completely, represent a profound threshold. The men were no longer soldiers in any meaningful sense. They were not yet prisoners. They were suspended in a kind of limbo, conscious that they had failed in a task they had been chosen for, uncertain of what failure might cost them personally. Some of the captains may have wondered if they should attempt to flee, to sail beyond Allied reach, perhaps to Argentina or some neutral nation. There is a romantic notion in the history of submarines that some commanders harbored such dreams. But the practical reality was that fuel was limited, supplies were dwindling, and the oceans were no longer safe corridors, but open waters patrolled by the victorious enemy. To flee would be to compound one failure with another. Better, perhaps, to accept what was coming than to prolong uncertainty with a desperate flight that would surely be discovered, surely be considered a violation of the surrender. Days passed at reduced speed. Radio messages came occasionally, confirming the reality that had been transmitted that first time. Yes, the war was truly over. Yes, they were to proceed toward the designated rendezvous point. Yes, they would be met by American vessels and transferred into custody. The sting of it, not the combat death that some might have almost welcomed as a conclusion, but the administrative machinery of defeat, the paperwork of capitulation. A submarine that had been designed as the ultimate expression of Japan's naval imagination, a secret weapon that had never truly been given the chance to prove itself or fail in open combat, would simply be given over to the enemy intact, ready to be studied, to be understood, to have its secrets extracted piece by piece. The men ate their rations without tasting them. They performed their duties without conviction. They waited in the hum and smell of the submarine, surrounded by the machinery that had kept them alive, knowing that machine would now become their prison until the Americans decided otherwise. And in that waiting, in that strange anticlimactic journey toward capitulation, something essential in the project of the I-400 submarines came to an end, not with fire or glory, but with the simple, crushing weight of reality that all ambitions, no matter how vast, no matter how secret, no matter how carefully engineered, must eventually confront. The waters around Japan in those final days held a strange, almost funeral stillness. The submarines that had been shrouded in secrecy for so long, the I-400 and her sisters, surfaced into a world that had already surrendered without them. The war had ended not with the sound of their aircraft engines, not with the distant thunder of their chosen targets, but with a broadcast from the Emperor himself, a voice crackling across the airwaves, speaking of endurance and the unbearable. The crews of those giant submarines, still at sea, still carrying their folded Seiran bombers in the darkness of their hangars, heard this news and understood that everything had changed, everything had collapsed. The grand ambition, the years of secrecy, the engineering marvels hidden beneath layers of steel and ocean, all of it had become, in a moment, obsolete. Irrelevant. A ghost story told by a ship that no longer had a war to fight. The process of surrender began not with fanfare, but with a peculiar kind of bureaucracy, the strange machinery of defeat grinding slowly into motion. The submarine commanders received their orders through naval channels, orders that felt almost dreamlike in their unreality. They were to surface, they were to display their flags, they were to make their way to designated points where they would encounter the very enemy they had spent years preparing to strike. There was, one imagines, a profound disorientation in this. A submarine that had been designed to infiltrate, to deceive, to arrive undetected, was now required to announce itself openly, to come into the light after months and years of calculated darkness. The transition was not violent. It was, in many ways, quieter than any battle could have been, a surrender of purpose rather than a surrender of force. The American Navy, for its part, was equally curious and skeptical. There were rumors, certainly, whispers of Japanese submarines of unusual size, of secret programs, of aircraft that could be launched from beneath the waves. But intelligence reports were fragmentary and often contradictory. When the I-400 and her sister ships began their careful ascent toward the surface, toward the designated rendezvous points, the Americans were unprepared for the sheer scale of what they were about to encounter. The I-400 seemed to rise and rise, hull after hull breaking the surface, as if the ocean itself were giving birth to some long-hidden leviathan. At over 400 feet in length, she dwarfed the American submarines that came to meet her. She dwarfed them as a blue whale dwarfs a dolphin. The crews of the smaller American boats stared across the water in something approaching disbelief. What was this thing? How had it been hidden from them? How many more were there? The actual handover was marked by a curious calm. There were no gunshots, no final dramatic moments of defiance. The I-400's crew, standing on deck in the open air for the first time in weeks, watched as American sailors approached in smaller boats. The Japanese officers transferred command with a precision and formality that seemed almost absurd in its civility. Here were men who had spent the entire war trying to destroy each other, and now they were exchanging documents, signing papers, speaking through interpreters in voices kept deliberately low and measured. It was as though both sides understood that something profound was ending, and that profundity demanded a kind of respectful silence. The ceremony of defeat, if it could be called that, was almost gentle. The hatches remained open, the weapons were secured. The long silence of those hangars, silence that had lasted for years, ever since the Seiran bombers had been carefully folded and stored in the darkness, continued unbroken. The aircraft inside would never fly. Their purpose had evaporated into the same atmosphere as the Emperor's voice on the radio. What must have moved through the minds of those Japanese sailors? The question lingers, soft and unanswerable. They had trained for years. They had maintained secrecy so complete that their own Navy headquarters sometimes wondered what was happening at Kure. They had been given a mission of such ambition, such impossible reach, that it seemed to exist in the realm of mythology rather than warfare. And then, suddenly, they were handing their ship over to the enemy, watching as American officers boarded their vessel, watched as American technicians began their careful inventory of systems and secrets. There was no surrender of pride, exactly. There was, instead, a kind of resignation that came from understanding that the larger forces at work had simply overwhelmed all smaller plans, all human schemes. The war was over because the war was over. The submarines were defeated because Japan was defeated. The logic was inexorable and complete. The Japanese crews were treated, by and large, with a professional courtesy that might have surprised them. The Americans recognized that they were dealing with skilled sailors, with engineers and officers who had achieved something remarkable. Whatever the original intentions had been, whatever targets had been planned, whatever damage might have been done, all of that had been rendered moot by the simple fact of surrender. The I-400 and her sisters were now, in effect, prizes, trophies of a sort, though that word seems too crude, too diminishing. They were more than that. They were puzzles. They were technological marvels that needed to be understood, examined, their secrets extracted and catalogued and filed away for future reference. The Americans understood, perhaps dimly but surely, that they had acquired something rare and valuable, a complete window into Japanese naval innovation at its absolute height, frozen at the moment of surrender, a snapshot of an alternative way of imagining submarine warfare, one that had incorporated the dimension of air power in a way that nobody else had quite managed. The strange calm that descended over these interactions, this was perhaps the strangest aspect of all. There was no triumph in it, not really. The Americans who boarded the I-400 were professionals, examining a professional military achievement. There was a kind of mutual recognition between warriors, even warriors on opposite sides, even warriors whose war had just ended. The Japanese sailors, exhausted and diminished and running on the fumes of orders that no longer had meaning, cooperated fully. They opened their hatches. They showed the Americans the hidden hangar. They revealed the folded aircraft, still pristine in their careful storage, still waiting for orders that would never come. The Americans moved through the submarines with a mixture of awe and clinical assessment, taking notes, measuring dimensions, understanding at last what they had been fighting against without quite knowing it. The vessels that had haunted American naval planners with their rumors and whispers were now open books, their secrets exposed to the light of day, their purpose nullified by the simple fact of peace. What strikes most forcefully about this moment of surrender is the absence of drama. War, when it is happening, feels dramatic. It feels urgent and consequential and terrible. But the ending of war, at least the ending of this particular aspect of it, had about it a quality of exhausted routine. Documents were signed, the submarines were photographed, the crews were processed. The machinery of military transition, whether in victory or defeat, ground along with methodical efficiency. The I-400 and her sisters, which had represented such an enormous expenditure of Japanese resources, which had incorporated such innovative thinking, which had been intended to reshape the Pacific Naval War, were now simply boats, captured boats, fascinating boats certainly, but boats nonetheless. The human ambitions that had filled them, the dreams of striking at America, of demonstrating Japanese ingenuity and determination, of achieving some final, impossible victory even as the war crumbled, all of that had evaporated as completely as morning mist. What remained was steel and mechanism, and the quiet resignation of men who understood that their time had passed. The journey from Sasebo to Pearl Harbor would take weeks. The I-400, I-401, and I-402 moved through Pacific waters under heavy escort now, no longer hunters but the hunted, or rather, the prized. American destroyers flanked them, their guns trained not in aggression but in vigilant protection. These were the most extraordinary submarines the world had ever built, and the Americans understood, with a clarity that sharpened as each nautical mile passed, that they held technology unlike anything in their own shipyards. The officers aboard those escort vessels had been briefed. They knew what lay inside those massive hulls. They knew about the hangar doors, the aircraft that could fold like origami, the range that seemed to defy the physics of conventional warfare. Still, seeing them in daylight, watching the superstructure rise above the water with an almost architectural solemnity, made the reality sink deeper into the collective American consciousness. The submarines arrived at Pearl Harbor in November 1945, 6 months after surrender. The harbor itself carried the ghosts of December 1941, the battleships that had sunk here, the men who had died, the sudden violence that had drawn America into this vast and terrible war. Now, in this same harbor, American sailors and engineers gathered to examine the instruments of a dream that had never quite taken shape. The I-400 was moored at the submarine base, and from the moment she settled into the water, she became the center of an intense, almost feverish scrutiny. The hangar doors were opened, the Seiran floatplanes were studied, measured, photographed from every angle. American technical officers moved through the boats with notebooks, cameras, and a kind of reverent attention that acknowledged what had been attempted here. They were not simply inspecting a defeated enemy's hardware. They were witnessing a path that history had not taken, a future that had collapsed at the moment of surrender. The inspection teams were thorough in ways that went beyond the merely military. Yes, they catalogued the engines, the ballast systems, the torpedoes, the fire control mechanisms, but they also examined the crew spaces, the galley where men had prepared meals, the bunks where sailors had tried to sleep in the narrow darkness, the wardroom where officers had plotted courses across unimaginable distances. Some of the American officers who walked through these spaces had themselves served in submarines, traditional submarines, the kind that hugged the coastlines and engaged in the grinding, desperate undersea war of the Atlantic and Pacific. To stand in the I-400 was to confront a scale of ambition that made their own vessels seem almost modest by comparison. What would it have felt like, they wondered, to command such a ship? What would it have meant to know that you carried within your hull an entire air wing, that you were not merely a submarine, but a platform from which to strike targets 1,000 miles inland? The technical evaluation took months. American engineers produced detailed drawings, created scale models, and began the work of understanding how the Japanese had solved problems that American designers had either overlooked or deemed impossible. The submarine itself became a kind of textbook, written in steel and rivets, teaching lessons that would influence American submarine design for decades to come. The large-scale compartmentalization, the innovative pressure hull design, the way the hangar had been integrated into the structure while maintaining watertight integrity, these were not trivial achievements. They represented the distilled knowledge of Japan's finest naval engineers, and they were now available to be studied, learned from, incorporated into the American arsenal. But the inspection was also shadowed by a deeper concern. The war with Germany had ended, and now the Soviet Union, which had been an ally in the fight against Japan, was becoming something else. Something uncertain. The vast resources of American military and scientific thought, which had been directed single-mindedly toward defeating enemies, were now beginning to divide and redirect themselves. And as that happened, questions arose about what should be preserved and what should be destroyed. The I-400 represented cutting-edge technology, yes, but it represented something more than that. It was a symbol of a particular vision of warfare, of what submarines could become if enough resources and genius were directed toward their development. In American hands, it was a prize. But in Soviet hands, that was a different question entirely. There existed, then, an unspoken anxiety moving through the discussions and meetings that took place in Washington and the Pentagon. The Soviets had their own submarine program, their own ambitions for underwater warfare. If they could examine the I-400, if they could study the Seiran floatplane, if they could extract the secrets locked within these vessels, what advantage might they gain? The Cold War was not yet a formal thing. It would take time to crystallize, to become the defining structure of the post-war world. But its shape was already forming in the minds of those who thought about such things. And the I-400 sat there in Pearl Harbor, a potential lever that could tilt the balance of technological advantage one way or another. The crews of the boats had been separated, dispersed. Some had been repatriated to Japan. Others remained in American custody for interrogation. They were asked to explain the systems, to describe their training, to recount what they had been told about their eventual mission. American officers listened to these accounts with the sense that they were hearing not just military information, but something more intimate, the thoughts and fears and ambitions of men who had lived inside these extraordinary machines. There was, in these interrogations, an odd kind of respect. The Japanese submariners had done nothing wrong, from the perspective of their orders and their duty. They had built vessels of remarkable sophistication, and had been prepared to take them into battle with a courage that was evident in their bearing and their words. The Americans recognized this, and it tempered the quality of the interrogation, gave it a dignity that was not always present in the post-war questioning of defeated enemies. The inspection also yielded a kind of melancholy recognition. The I-400 had been built to wage a kind of war that, by the time she was ready, could not be waged. The submarine represented a dead vision, a strategic doctrine that had become obsolete even as the vessel herself was being perfected. The strategy of striking at distant targets, of carrying warfare to the American continent, of achieving victory through the application of innovative technology and brilliant engineering, it had all been overshadowed by the sheer weight of American industrial production, by the relentless advance of American forces across the Pacific, by the atomic bomb. The I-400 was a monument to a particular kind of ambition, a particular faith in what technology could accomplish, But that faith had been overtaken by events, and now the boat herself was being studied not as a weapon that might change the course of the war, but as a historical artifact, a window into what might have been. And so the I-400 boats, having survived the journey home, having crossed thousands of miles through waters patrolled by enemies who no longer existed, found themselves at the threshold of a peculiar new chapter, one that would be written not by Japanese hands, but by the anxious deliberations of American strategists now facing a different kind of war altogether. In the months following Japan's surrender in August of 1945, the Soviet Union had begun to cast its long shadow across the Pacific. Stalin's ambitions in the Far East were becoming clearer with each passing week, and American military planners found themselves in an unexpected position. They possessed not only the three I-400 class submarines, but also access to their designs, their specifications, their revolutionary architecture. The question that kept them awake in Washington, in Pearl Harbor, in the corridors of naval intelligence, was this: what would happen if such technology fell into Soviet hands? What if the technical secrets of these underwater carriers, these hybrid vessels that could project air power across oceans, became available to the emerging Soviet Navy, still in its infancy, but growing with ruthless determination? The solution that emerged was, in its way, both practical and tragic. It came to be known as Operation Road's End, and it represented the closest thing to a secret consensus that could emerge from the bureaucratic machinery of the nascent Cold War. The Americans had studied the I-400 boats intensively. They had examined every weld, every compartment, every ingenious solution to the problem of housing aircraft inside a submarine's hull. They had learned what they needed to learn, and now, they decided, these vessels could not be allowed to become bargaining chips or strategic assets for the Soviets to acquire. The decision carried a peculiar irony, didn't it? Japan had built these submarines in defiance of conventional wisdom, had poured immense resources into their construction during a war they were losing, had maintained their secrecy with an almost desperate vigilance. And now, in the hands of the nation that had defeated them, they would be erased as if they had never truly existed at all. The Americans saw this not as destruction, but as containment, strategic necessity, the lesser evil compared to the alternative. In June of 1946, nearly a year after the Japanese surrender, the decision came down through official channels. The I-400, the I-401, and the I-402, these three remarkable vessels, the most advanced submarines of their era, would be sunk in deep water off the coast of Hawaii. Not in battle, not in some final glorious desperate action, but deliberately, methodically, with documentation carefully filed away in classified archives that would remain sealed for decades. It was the opposite of the watery grave that had claimed so many vessels during the war years. This would be a chosen descent into darkness, a deliberate forgetting. The crews who had once served aboard these submarines, who had trained in secret dockyards, who had navigated through enemy-infested waters, they were not present for this ending. That absence somehow makes it quieter, doesn't it? There were no ceremonial farewell volleys, no solemn proceedings on the deck of an escort vessel. The scuttling was handled with the clinical efficiency of a classified military operation. The I-400 was towed out into the Pacific, and on June 17th charges were placed in her hull. She sank beneath the surface of the water that had once been her domain, and with her went the physical manifestation of an entire ambitious program. The I-401 followed days later, and then the I-402. 3 submarines, representing months of engineering genius, representing the ambitions of an empire, representing the culmination of years of secret effort, all descending into the abyssal darkness, their wrecks settling onto the ocean floor where they would rest, essentially unknown for generations. The Americans kept the 3 remaining unfinished hulls from the Sentoku-class construction program, subjecting them to even more exhaustive analysis before they too were eventually disposed of, though less ceremonially. What's remarkable, what perhaps invites quiet reflection, is how effectively Operation Road's End worked, how thoroughly it accomplished its intended purpose. The technology of the I-400 boats did not transfer to the Soviets. The design details, the engineering innovations, the very concept of the submarine aircraft carrier would not influence the Soviet naval program in any direct way. The physical evidence had been removed from history, sunk beneath thousands of feet of water, in a place where no one would think to look, where the currents and the pressure and the darkness would gradually conceal them further. Yet the knowledge itself, the intellectual understanding of what was possible, the technical drawings filed in archives, the memories of the men who had built and served these vessels that could not be similarly erased, the Americans had extracted what they needed. The engineering principles would seed themselves into the American submarine program in ways both obvious and subtle. The very question of how to combine submarine capabilities with air power would echo forward into the Cold War years, into discussions of future weapons systems, into classified planning sessions about undersea warfare. One might wonder, in the stillness of this narration, whether the men who made the decision to scuttle the I-400 boats understood the full weight of what they were doing. Were they troubled by it? Did they see it as a necessary sacrifice to the emerging realities of geopolitical competition? Or did it seem, in the context of those urgent post-war years, simply like the obvious choice, the pragmatic answer to a problem that had no comfortable resolution? The ocean, after all, is the ultimate classifier. It keeps secrets better than any filing cabinet, any locked vault. Sunken ships rest in darkness absolute, in pressures that crush, in cold that preserves. They become something other than weapons, other than strategic assets, other than the products of human ambition. They become history, distant, inaccessible, slowly forgotten. And perhaps that's what the operation was really about. Not just preventing the Soviets from obtaining the technology, though that was certainly part of it, but also closing a chapter that could not remain open. The I-400 program had been an artifact of a different war, a different world order, a different Japan. Those submarines belonged to a past that was rapidly receding. Sinking them was, in its way, a final acceptance of that fact, a deliberate choice to let that chapter fall away, to ensure it would not linger as a complication in the new world being built atop the ruins of the old. And so the I-400 and her sisters slipped into a different kind of darkness than any they had known during the war. Their hulls, which had sailed through enemy waters and carried such fervent ambition across the Pacific, found themselves at last in the quiet oblivion of the deep, somewhere in the vastness beyond the continental shelf, in waters where the pressure would have crushed a man to nothing in moments. The great submarines came to rest. The engineered precision of their construction, those careful welds, the intricate valves, the hangar doors that had been designed with such ingenuity to protect aircraft from the salt and chaos of the sea, all of it surrendered gradually to the work of time and corrosion. Rust blooms began their patient bloom across the steel. The seals that had held back the ocean for so many years softened and failed. There is something profoundly quieting about contemplating a wreck site. The violence that sent a ship to the bottom, or in this case, the deliberate choice of scuttling, becomes abstract when you imagine the vessel many fathoms down, settling into the sediment like a whale falling into the abyss. The I-400 rests now in a kind of cathedral silence. Fish move through her corridors where men once rushed through companionways. Silt has begun to cover the serial numbers and the evidence of manufacture. The ocean, which respects neither empire nor ambition, has reclaimed what was always borrowed from it. What might a diver find? Were they to descend into those waters and navigate the wreckage, they would encounter a submarine that is, in many ways, a time capsule of 1940s Japanese naval engineering. The pressure hull remains largely intact, shaped like a great elongated drum. The conning tower, that distinctive protrusion that served as the brain of the vessel during operations, still points upward into the darkness. The periscope shafts, the antenna masts, the fair water planes all frozen in their final positions. And somewhere within that steel envelope, if the hatch seals have held true, are the spaces where men slept in narrow bunks, where officers pored over charts and calculated distances, where engineers tended the diesel engines and the electric motors that gave the submarine its life beneath the waves. The aircraft hangar, that revolutionary feature which distinguished the I-400 from every other submarine in the world, lies dark and empty now. No Seiran floatplane waits folded within those steel walls, ready to unfold and take wing. The hangar door, which once swung open to the moonlit sky in the final weeks before the war's end, has long since corroded shut. It is sealed by time itself, a portal that will not open again. And yet, in its emptiness, there is something poignant. That space was designed with such precision, such hope, for a purpose that was never fulfilled. How many times did the engineers at Cure recalculate its dimensions, refine its tolerances, imagining the moment when it would finally serve its intended function? The hangar survived to see that moment only in the rarest, most desperate circumstances. It never saw the glory it was built for. It saw only the endgame. When you rest with your mind on a wreck site like this, you are essentially contemplating the end of a vision. The I-400 program was born from ambition so grand that it proposed to reach across an entire world. It imagined Japanese submarines resurfacing in the Indian Ocean, in the Atlantic, bringing the war to enemy shores in ways that seemed almost impossibly audacious. The men who designed these vessels believed in their own ingenuity absolutely. They believed in the superiority of their engineering, in the invincibility of their craft, and in some measurable ways they were right. The I-400 was a marvel. There was nothing quite like it in any navy. The strategic thinking behind it was sound. But sound strategy cannot overcome the larger currents of history. No amount of engineering innovation can turn back the tide of a war that has already been lost on 1,000 other battlefields. This is perhaps what the ocean floor teaches most gently, most definitively. The sea floor knows no pride. It honors no national glory. A sunken ship is simply matter settling into its final resting place. The I-400 sank not because her design was flawed, but because the moment for her use had passed. The war ended before she could accomplish any of her missions. The technology that seemed so revolutionary in 1944 became obsolete before it could prove itself in earnest combat. And the secrecy that had shrouded the program so carefully, that had isolated her crews from the outside world, meant that her story would be hidden from history for decades. How many people in Japan even knew that such vessels existed? How many knew what had been achieved in those Kure shipyards? The wartime newspapers certainly did not speak of them. The people on the streets of Tokyo could not have conceived of such a submarine. Even those high in the naval hierarchy sometimes seemed uncertain about the I-400 program's actual status or purpose. In the years after the war, when the United States Navy inspected the surrendered submarines and then scuttled them in Operation Road's End, they were determined that no other nation, particularly the Soviet Union, would ever capture or study their secrets. And so the decision was made to send them to the bottom deliberately, to ensure that whatever knowledge they contained would be lost to the deep. There is an irony in this, is there not? These vessels, built in secret, shrouded in security protocols, dedicated to a mission that never came to full realization, were then deliberately sunk to prevent their secrets from being discovered. From birth to grave, the I-400 and her sisters lived under a veil of concealment. Even in death, they were being hidden. Yet hiding and forgetting are not quite the same thing. The wrecks have been found in recent years. Researchers with deep-diving submersibles have descended to the sites and filmed the corroded hulls, the collapsed superstructures, the slow work of rust and time. And in discovering them again, we have retrieved something of the story that the ocean seemed to have claimed forever. We know where they rest. We know roughly what they were. We know something of the men who crewed them. The technology that was deemed too dangerous to let the Soviets find is now known to historians and engineers who study the evolution of submarine design. The secrets have escaped the depths in the end, not because the ocean released them, but because human curiosity and persistence eventually followed them down. What does the I-400 tell us in the quiet hours when we drift towards sleep with these images in mind? Perhaps it speaks to the fundamental difference between human intention and human outcome. We design, we build, we imagine the future with such clarity. We create monuments to our ambition, vessels of steel large enough to carry aircraft across oceans. We gather thousands of workers. We invest years of labor. We perfect minute details in the hope that everything will work as planned. And yet the future does not follow our blueprints. War ends when we expected it to continue. Our grandest achievements accomplish nothing. Our most elaborate plans meet the indifference of circumstance. The I-400 submarines were built to change the course of history. Instead, they became monuments to a moment that passed before they could be properly used. There is also something to contemplate about secrecy itself. The I-400 program was so thoroughly classified, so completely hidden from public knowledge, that its very existence remained unknown to most of the world for many years after the war. The men who worked on it, who dedicated their professional lives to the project, had to carry that knowledge in silence, even in peacetime. One might think that such secrecy, such complete compartmentalization, would have preserved the importance of the program. Surely something hidden so carefully must be tremendously significant. And yet the program itself became, in a sense, a historical ghost. It had no public legacy. It influenced no post-war debates. It shaped no memories or monuments. It was simply gone, forgotten, at the bottom of the ocean. Is there anything more lonely than a secret that dies with those who kept it? Is there any more fitting end for a classified project than to be scuttled and forgotten, known to no one? And yet we are here now, thinking about these submarines and their crews in the darkness. We are imagining the cold pressure of the deep, the slow sinking of hulls into darkness, the patient corrosion of steel and wire and machinery. We are contemplating the lives of the men who served aboard these vessels, the specialized training they underwent, the loneliness of knowing something that could never be discussed, the strange unreality of commanding a secret weapon in a secret war. We are sitting with the knowledge that ambition and engineering, no matter how brilliant, cannot always overcome the larger forces of history. The ocean floor is perhaps the most honest place in the world. It records nothing but the facts of physics and time. It does not judge whether a ship was built for noble purposes or ignoble ones. It does not mourn the loss of potential or the failure of grand designs. It simply holds them, as it holds all things that are given to it. The I-400 rests there now, alongside the wrecks of countless other vessels, other monuments to human effort and human error. The fish that swim through her compartments know nothing of the war, nothing of the pilots who were supposed to fly from her deck, nothing of the Panama Canal that was never attacked, or the American fleet that was never struck. To them, she is simply a structure in their environment, a place of shelter and hunting grounds. This is perhaps the deepest teaching of the I-400 story. Everything we build, no matter how ingenious, is temporary. Every secret, no matter how carefully guarded, eventually dissolves. Every ambition, no matter how grand, becomes subject to forces larger than itself. The submarines were meant to be invulnerable, unsinkable, revolutionary. Instead, they became historical curiosities, wrecks on the seafloor, lessons in humility. And in that transformation, in that descent from the heights of wartime hope to the quiet rest on the ocean floor, there is a kind of peace. There is an acceptance of the natural order of things. There is the understanding that nothing human-made endures forever, and perhaps that is not a tragedy, but simply the way of the world.